Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I was the last one still out that night, and the roads were an absolute mess. Let me give you some context here. I've been driving snowplows for the county for almost 15 years. Started right out of high school when I realized college wasn't for me and I needed steady work that paid decent. Plowing isn't glamorous. It's long hours, brutal conditions, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and doesn't leave until spring. But it's honest work, and in a small town like ours, it's necessary work. When the snow comes down, we're the ones who keep civilization functioning, who make sure emergency vehicles can reach people who need help, who clear the paths that connect our scattered community. That particular December had been relentless. Storm after storm rolling through, each one dropping anywhere from 8 to 18 inches. We'd been running double shifts, catching sleep in 4-hour windows, living on gas station coffee, and whatever food we could grab between runs. My truck, a massive International with a 12-foot plow blade, had become more familiar to me than my own bedroom. I knew every rattle, every quirk, every sound it made when the transmission shifted. This night, though, this was different. The visibility had tanked to the point where I could barely see beyond the hood of the truck, even with the high beams on and the light bar blazing. The snow wasn't just falling, it was being driven horizontally by winds that had to be hitting 40, 50 miles per hour. It created this disorienting white static, like trying to see through a television tuned to a dead channel. Every few seconds, I'd catch a glimpse of a reflective mile marker or the vague shadow of a tree line, but mostly I was navigating by memory and instinct, feeling the road beneath my tires more than seeing it. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio around 10:47 p.m. Even through the static, I could hear something in her tone that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. Sarah had been dispatching for almost as long as I'd been driving, and she wasn't the type to get rattled easily. But tonight, there was this hesitation in her voice, this careful choosing of words that immediately put me on edge. Unit 7, this is dispatch. Got a situation developing out on Route 71. You still in the area? I keyed the radio. Yeah, Sarah. I'm about 6 miles north of the junction. What's going on? There was a pause, longer than there should have been. In that silence, I could hear other voices in the background of the dispatch center, muffled conversation that sounded urgent. We received a call approximately 30 minutes ago from a residence off Route 71, near the old Hartley Farm access road. Female caller sounded middle-aged, reported a vehicle stalled on the road near her property, said there was a young child inside, alone. Toddler, she said. No adult visible. My foot eased off the gas slightly. Did she give a vehicle description? Plate number? That's the thing. Sarah's voice trailed off. No description, no plate. She said she couldn't get close enough to see details because of the snow, but she seemed certain about the child. Is she still on the line? Negative. The call dropped mid-conversation. We tried calling back multiple times. No answer. GPS gave us a rough location, but it's not precise. Somewhere off Route 71, past the turnoff to the preserve. You know that area's spotty for cell reception, even in good weather. I did know. That stretch of Route 71 ran through some of the most isolated territory in the county. Abandoned farmland, dense forest, scattered houses that had been empty for years. The kind of place where you could be in real trouble, and no one would know for hours, maybe days if the storm kept up. You want me to check it out? Another pause. You're the only unit we have in that area with 4-wheel drive and chains. Everyone else has pulled off the roads until visibility improves. If there really is a child out there. She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what could happen to a toddler left alone in a stalled vehicle during a blizzard like this. Even if the engine was running, carbon monoxide could be building up. If the engine had died, the temperature inside would drop rapidly. We were talking about a matter of hours, maybe less. "I'm on it," I said. "Going to take me a while to get there in this mess. Keep trying that number." "Will do. Be careful, 7. I redirected south, cutting across a county road that would intersect with Route 71. The going was slower than I'd anticipated. The snow had drifted across the road in places, creating barriers that even my plow struggled to push through. At one point, I had to back up and take a running start at a drift that had to be 4 feet high. The truck shuddered as the blade hit it, the impact traveling up through the steering column and into my arms. It took me almost 40 minutes to reach the area Sarah had described. Route 71 out here was barely recognizable, just a slightly flatter expanse between tree lines, the center line and shoulder completely obliterated by snow. I slowed to a crawl, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of the access road she'd mentioned, the old Hartley farm. I dredged up memories from my years of driving these routes. The Hartley place had been abandoned since, the early 2000s? There'd been some kind of family tragedy. I couldn't remember the details. The house had been sitting empty ever since, slowly collapsing in on itself while nature reclaimed the land. I'd driven past the access road hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. There. A gap in the trees on the eastern side, barely visible through the snow. No mailbox, no sign, nothing to indicate it was anything other than a random break in the forest. I would have missed it completely if I hadn't been looking for it specifically. I turned onto what I assumed was the driveway, though calling it that was generous. It was more like a suggestion of where a driveway had once been. 2 ruts filled with snow, winding between overgrown trees whose branches scraped against the sides of my truck with sounds like fingernails on metal. Maybe 30 yards in, something caught the plow blade, a hard, metallic screech that cut through even the howling wind. The truck jolted violently, nearly causing me to bite my tongue. I threw the transmission into park and killed the engine, sitting there for a moment to let my heart rate settle. Whatever I'd hit, it was solid. Probably part of an old fence or farm equipment that had been left to rust in the weeds. I grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket, a heavy mag light that doubled as a club if necessary, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath. This wasn't just cold. This was the kind of deep, penetrating cold that made your teeth ache and your lungs burn with each inhalation. The snow immediately clung to my coat, my face, working its way into every gap in my clothing. I made my way to the front of the truck, boots sinking past my ankles with each step. The flashlight beam cut through the swirling snow, revealing the source of the impact, an old metal gate, half buried and twisted, with rusted posts still anchored in frozen earth. The plow had caught it at an angle, buckling it but not breaking it free. I stood there, playing the flashlight beam around the immediate area, and that's when I noticed something that made me pause. There were no tracks. I don't mean fresh tracks. Obviously, the snow would have filled those in quickly. I mean, there were no indentations at all, no compressed areas that would indicate a vehicle had passed through recently. The snow covering the driveway was perfectly uniform, pristine, completely undisturbed except for the path my own truck had just carved. If someone had driven in here, whether it was the woman who supposedly called or the stalled vehicle with the child, there should have been some trace. Even heavy snow like this couldn't fill entire tracks completely in just 30 or 40 minutes. There should have been depressions, shadows, something. A prickle of unease worked its way down my spine, but I shook it off. Maybe I was wrong about the time frame. Maybe the call had come in longer ago than Sarah had indicated, giving the snow more time to cover any evidence. Or maybe the car had come in from a different direction, through the woods somehow. None of those explanations felt quite right, but I was already here. I wasn't turning back without at least checking the house. I returned to the truck and backed up carefully, then maneuvered around the damaged gate. The driveway, if you could call it that, continued to wind through increasingly dense vegetation. Branches pressed in from both sides, their bare limbs looking like skeletal fingers in the flashlight beam. The snow was deeper here, protected from the wind by the canopy of trees, and my truck struggled to maintain traction. Then, through the curtain of falling snow, a structure began to materialize. The Hartley house. Even in the limited visibility, I could tell it was massive, one of those turn-of-the-century farmhouses that spoke of a time when this area had been productive agricultural land, when families had built homes meant to last generations. 3 stories tall, with a wide front porch and multiple gables, it loomed out of the darkness like something from a Gothic novel. But time and neglect had not been kind to it. The porch roof sagged dramatically on one end, held up by what looked like a single struggling support post. Several windows on the upper floors were broken or missing entirely, their empty frames staring out like hollow eye sockets. The siding, what I could see of it, was weathered to a uniform gray, peeling away in long strips. And sitting in what would have been the front yard, positioned at a strange angle like it had tried to reverse into the trees and given up halfway through, was a mid-size sedan. My headlights caught it as I made the final turn around the bend in the driveway, and I felt my breath catch. The car's lights were on, both headlights burning bright against the wall of falling snow. The engine was running. I could see the faint shimmer of exhaust coming from the tailpipe, distorting the air above it. But there was something immediately wrong about the scene, something that made my cop-trained instincts flare up even before I could articulate what it was. The windows were completely fogged over, covered in a thick layer of condensation that obscured any view of the interior. Not unusual in cold weather, the temperature differential between inside and outside would create that kind of moisture. But there was something about the pattern of it, the way it seemed too uniform, too complete. I brought my truck to a stop about 20 feet behind the sedan, angling it so my headlights would provide maximum illumination. Left the engine running and the light bar on. If I was going to be out here, I wanted to be visible, wanted to be able to get back in my truck and leave quickly if necessary. As I approached the sedan on foot, the snow crunching under my boots seemed unnaturally loud, each step echoing in the strange acoustic deadness that heavy snowfall creates. I could see a figure in the driver's seat, just a dark shape through the fogged glass, completely motionless. I knocked on the driver's side window. 3 sharp raps with my knuckle. Nothing. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, didn't react in any way. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Ma'am, sir, this is county maintenance. Are you okay in there?" Still no response. My hand moved instinctively to my belt, where I carried a small knife in a leather sheath. Not a weapon, really, just a tool for cutting stuck seatbelts or rope. But I found myself unsnapping the sheath anyway, some primitive part of my brain recognizing danger, even if my conscious mind hadn't caught up yet. I moved to the passenger side, boots slipping slightly on the snow-covered ground, and tried the door handle. It opened immediately, without resistance, and a wave of heat rolled out of the car's interior, thick, stale air that carried with it an odor I couldn't immediately place. It was sharp and metallic, like the smell of old pennies mixed with something organic, something that reminded me of the way damp wool smells when it's been sitting in a closed container for too long. The kind of smell that settles into your throat and sinuses that you can't quite shake even after you've left the source behind. Inside, the woman sat perfectly still, hands locked on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. Her knuckles were white from the pressure of her grip, tendons standing out against the skin. She was staring straight ahead through the fogged windshield, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, and her face was completely expressionless. Not frightened, not calm, just blank. Like a mannequin arranged in a car for some kind of bizarre display. And on her lap, bundled in what looked like a heavy blanket, was a small child. A toddler, just as the caller had reported. His face was turned in toward her chest, one small hand visible above the edge of the blanket, and he appeared to be sleeping. The inside of the windshield, I noticed, was covered in streaks, long, irregular marks that definitely weren't frost and didn't look like normal condensation patterns. They looked like someone had run their fingers across the glass, dragging through the moisture to create these random designs. But the marks were on the inside of the windshield, and the woman's hands had never left the steering wheel. "Ma'am," I said, more gently this time. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" For several long seconds she didn't respond. Then, with a slowness that seemed almost mechanical, she turned her head toward me. The movement was wrong somehow, too smooth, too controlled, lacking the normal imprecision of human motion. When her eyes met mine, there was a moment of connection that made something cold and primal spike through my chest. Her pupils were dilated enormously, nearly obscuring the iris, and there was this quality to her gaze that I can't adequately describe. It was like looking at someone who was seeing something completely different from what was actually in front of them. "He didn't want to stay in the house anymore," she said. Her voice was soft, almost dreamy, with a peculiar flatness that made the words sound rehearsed. I blinked, trying to process this non sequitur. "Ma'am, are you the one who called for help? We got a report about—" "That wasn't me," she interrupted, shaking her head with that same unsettling smoothness. "I don't have a phone anymore. Haven't had one I don't remember how long." The child stirred slightly, making a small sound, not quite a whimper, more like a sigh. The woman's hand moved to stroke his hair, the gesture tender but somehow mechanical, like she was going through the motions of maternal comfort without actually feeling it. "Ma'am, it's not safe out here," I said, trying to keep my voice level and authoritative without being threatening. "The storm's getting worse. We need to get you and your son somewhere warm, somewhere safe. My truck has heat, and I can take you." "He doesn't like the snow," she said, as if I hadn't spoken. "It makes him remember." "Remember what?" She didn't answer. Her eyes had drifted past me now, focusing on something beyond my shoulder, beyond the truck, beyond the physical space we occupied. The snow was falling harder now, if that was even possible. My shoulders were already soaked through despite my heavy coat, and I could feel moisture working its way down my spine. Standing out here much longer wasn't sustainable, and I was becoming increasingly concerned about the child. Something about him wasn't right. His coloring looked off even in the limited light, and his breathing seemed too shallow, too irregular. "Ma'am, I need you to let me take your son," I said firmly. "Just to my truck where it's warm. Then we can figure out what to do next, but we can't stay out here." Her head swiveled back toward me with that same mechanical smoothness, and for the first time, something like emotion flickered across her face. But it wasn't fear or concern or even confusion. It was something I couldn't quite identify, something that made my hand tighten on the doorframe. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she whispered. "What do you mean, yet? Ma'am, I don't understand what—" "They're watching you," she said, her voice still barely above a whisper, but carrying an urgency that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned instinctively, scanning the area behind me. The house loomed in the darkness, every window black and empty. The porch sagged under its burden of accumulated snow. Nothing moved except the endless curtain of falling white. But something about the house had changed. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. No lights had come on, no doors had opened, no figures had appeared in the windows, yet I had this overwhelming sensation of being observed, of attention focused on me with an intensity that was almost physical. It was the feeling you get when someone is staring at you from across a room, that prickling awareness that activates some primitive part of your brain that evolved to detect predators in tall grass. "Ma'am, is someone in that house?" "They always watch," she said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality now. "They always watch when someone new comes. They've been waiting. They're always waiting." I turned back to her, trying to catch her eye, to ground her in reality. Who's watching? Who are they? Ma'am, if someone is threatening you, if you're in danger. The child twitched. It wasn't a normal movement, not the kind of restless shift a sleeping toddler makes. His spine arched backward suddenly, sharply, his small body going rigid in his mother's arms. His arm shot out from under the blanket, fingers splayed and trembling, reaching toward nothing. Then just as suddenly, he went completely limp, collapsing back against her like a puppet with its strings cut. The woman made a sound, low, guttural, halfway between a groan and a gasp. Her entire body went stiff, and her lips parted to reveal teeth clenched so tightly I could see the muscles in her jaw standing out like cables. The child whimpered again, a choked sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and I saw his hand clench into a tiny fist. That was enough. Whatever was happening here, whether it was medical or psychological or something I couldn't begin to understand, that child needed help immediately. "I'm taking him," I said, not asking permission anymore. "Right now." I reached in, and that's when the woman's hand shot out and clamped around my wrist. Her grip was vice-like, far stronger than seemed possible for someone of her slight build, and her skin was cold, not just winter cold, but deeply, unnaturally cold, like touching marble that had been stored in a freezer. She turned her head toward me again, but this time the movement wasn't smooth. It was jerky, almost spasmodic, her neck muscles twitching visibly under her skin. When she looked at me, her pupils had constricted to pinpoints, and I could see the full color of her irises, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed almost gray in the dim light. "He is mine," she said, and her voice was different now, deeper, resonant, carrying an authority that made my breath catch. For a moment, we were frozen there, her hand locked around my wrist, my hand hovering inches from the child. Both of us caught in this bizarre tableau while snow swirled around us and the car's engine continued its steady rumble. Then I did something that, looking back, probably saved my life, or at least my sanity. I looked her directly in the eyes and said, with all the calm authority I could muster, "I'm a county employee responding to a welfare check. I have both the legal right and the moral obligation to ensure this child's safety. Now, you can let go of my wrist, or I can call for law enforcement backup. Either way, I'm not leaving here without checking on that child's condition." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect, or possibly just a recalculation of whatever strange math she was running in her head. Her grip loosened slightly, and I took the opportunity to pull my wrist free. The child's eyes had opened. They were unfocused, glassy, staring at something beyond my shoulder. His lips moved, forming words that were too quiet for me to hear over the wind and the engine. I leaned in slightly, trying to catch what he was saying, and that's when I noticed it. The words traced into the fog on the inside of the windshield, right above the woman's head, written in that same irregular script created by drawing through condensation. "He is mine." The letters were fresh, moisture still beading along their edges, slowly trickling down the glass. And they hadn't been there 30 seconds ago when I'd first approached the car. I was certain of that. My training and my experience, everything in my background that told me to stay calm and rational and work the problem systematically. All of it evaporated in that moment. I reached past the woman, not caring anymore about her protestations or her unsettling behavior, and I grabbed the child. She didn't fight me this time. Her hands were still locked on the steering wheel, fingers practically fused to it, and as I pulled the child away from her, I had to literally peel each of her fingers loose, one by one. They bent backward at angles that should have been painful, but she made no sound, showed no reaction. The child was lighter than he should have been, disturbingly light, like he was hollow somehow. His eyes were still open but unseeing, and his skin had that gray, waxy quality that I'd seen before on people in the advanced stages of hypothermia. I bundled him against my chest, trying to share body heat, and backed away from the car. The moment I cleared the passenger door, the car's engine died. Not sputtered, not coughed, just died, immediately and completely, as if someone had reached in and yanked out the key. The headlights went dark simultaneously, plunging the area into the relative dimness of my truck's light bar and the strange ambient glow that heavy snowfall creates at night. I spun around, already moving toward my truck, the child clutched against my chest. Behind me, I heard the driver's door open, a rusty creak of hinges that sounded far too loud in the sudden silence left by the dead engine. I didn't turn around. I didn't look back. Some instinct deeper than thought told me that looking would be a mistake, that seeing what had just gotten out of that car would change something fundamental in my understanding of reality, would open a door in my mind that I wouldn't be able to close again. I walked fast toward my truck, boots sinking into the snow with each step, the child's weight barely registering in my arms. He was so still now, not even breathing that I could tell, though surely he must have been. The snow seemed to be falling even harder, and the distance between the sedan and my truck felt like it had tripled, like I was walking through one of those nightmares where your destination keeps receding no matter how fast you move. Behind me, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not crunching through the snow but making a different sound, a whisper soft displacement, like something moving across the surface rather than through it. Don't look back. Don't look back. Don't look. I reached my truck, yanked open the passenger door, and practically dove inside, pulling the child in with me. I slammed the door hard enough to rock the entire vehicle on its suspension, and immediately hit the lock button. All the doors chunked into their locked positions with a sound that was absurdly comforting. Only then, with solid metal and glass between me and whatever was outside, did I allow myself to turn around and look through the passenger window. The woman stood beside the sedan, exactly where I'd left her. She was completely still, arms hanging at her sides, head tilted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for anyone with functioning vertebrae. The falling snow settled on her hair, her shoulders, her upturned face, but she didn't move to brush it away. She just stood there, staring in my direction. No. Not in my direction, directly at me. Through the snow and the darkness and the distance, I could feel her gaze like a physical weight. I set the child down carefully in the passenger seat. He was still limp, still unresponsive, but I could see the slight rise and fall of his chest now. Breathing, alive. Whatever else was wrong with him, he was alive. I grabbed my radio, keyed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I've got..." Static. Loud, overwhelming static that made me wince and pull the radio away from my ear. I released the button, waited a moment, tried again. "Dispatch Unit 7. Do you copy?" More static, but this time there was something underneath it. Not words exactly, but a rhythmic pulsing, like someone breathing slowly and deliberately into an open microphone. It rose and fell with an organic quality that made my skin crawl. I tried my cell phone. No signal. Not even a single bar. Just that empty triangle with an X through it. The child made a sound. Not a cry or a whimper, but words. Clear, distinct words spoken in a voice that sounded far too mature for someone of his apparent age. "I told her you'd come instead." I looked down at him. His eyes were still open, still unfocused, still staring at nothing. But his lips had definitely moved, and the voice had definitely come from him. What did you say?" His eyes slowly tracked toward me, achieving focus for the first time. They were dark, so dark the pupil was indistinguishable from the iris, and looking into them gave me that same sensation of vertigo I'd felt looking into his mother's eyes. "She asked for help," he said in that same incongruously adult voice. "But you came. Not who she wanted. You. Who did she want?" His lips curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles weren't supposed to convey warmth or happiness or any recognizable human emotion. "Someone else," he whispered. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, showing only the whites, and he went completely limp. I reached out instinctively to check his pulse, training overriding the screaming voice in my head that was telling me to get the hell out of there immediately, and found a heartbeat. Slow but steady. He was breathing regularly now, too, his color starting to improve from that deathly gray to something approaching normal. Movement outside caught my attention. The woman was walking, not toward my truck, but toward the house. That same slow, gliding motion, her feet making no visible impression in the deep snow. She reached the sagging porch steps and ascended them without pause, without looking back. The front door, which I could have sworn was closed when I arrived, stood open. She passed through it into the darkness beyond, and the door swung shut behind her with a finality that I could feel even from inside my truck. The house itself seemed to settle, shadows shifting in ways that had nothing to do with the movement of my light bar or the falling snow. For just a moment I saw, or thought I saw, faces in the windows. Not clear images, just the suggestion of faces, pale shapes that might have been reflections or might have been something else entirely. Then they were gone, and the house was just a house again. An abandoned, collapsing structure slowly being reclaimed by nature and time. I put my truck in reverse and started backing down the driveway, not willing to turn around, needing to keep the house in view until I absolutely couldn't anymore. The child remained unconscious beside me, breathing peacefully now, looking for all the world like any normal toddler taking a nap. When I finally reached Route 71 and could turn around properly, I pressed the accelerator harder than was probably safe given the road conditions and didn't ease up until I saw the lights of town glowing on the horizon. Music, brief transition, wind sounds fading to silence. The EMTs didn't reach us until almost midnight. 2 full hours of me sitting in my truck in a gas station parking lot, engine running, doors locked, watching the child sleep and occasionally stirring to make sure he was still breathing. When the ambulance finally arrived, lights cutting through the storm, I felt something in my chest unclench slightly. They took him carefully, professionally, asking me the standard questions about where I'd found him, his condition, any visible injuries. I gave them the basic facts. Stalled vehicle, unresponsive parent, child showing signs of hypothermia, and omitted everything else. What would I have said? That his mother had warned me something was watching. That he'd spoken in a voice that didn't belong to a toddler. That I'd seen words written in condensation that appeared on their own. They would have thought the stress of the storm had gotten to me. Maybe they would have been right. The child watched me as they loaded him into the ambulance. His eyes were normal now, bright, curious, the eyes of a regular kid. He smiled at me, a genuine child's smile, and waved with one small hand. I waved back automatically, and the ambulance doors closed. I never saw him again. The next day, when the storm had passed and the sun was shining with that impossible brightness that only comes after a heavy snowfall, I filed my report with the supervisor. "Standard missing person case," I said. "One adult female, last seen at the old Hartley property on Route 71. I provided a description, though I found myself struggling to remember specific details. Her height? Average, I thought. Hair color? Dark, maybe. Age? Middle-aged? Every detail seemed to slip away like water through my fingers the moment I tried to focus on it. They sent a crew out to investigate. I didn't go with them. I suddenly, desperately needed a day off, and for once, my supervisor didn't argue. They found the car. It was right where I'd left it, buried under an additional 8 inches of snow, but otherwise undisturbed. The engine was cold, had been for hours. Probably. They popped the hood and found the battery stone dead, terminals so corroded they could barely make out the metal underneath. The mechanic who towed it said the corrosion was consistent with years of neglect, not a vehicle that had been running the night before. But I'd seen the exhaust coming from the tailpipe. I'd felt the heat rolling out when I opened the door. The engine had been running. I was absolutely certain of it. They didn't find the woman. No footprints leading away from the vehicle. No signs of anyone entering the house. The house itself was exactly as expected. Structurally unsound, filled with animal droppings and debris, abandoned for years. No evidence anyone had been inside in ages, let alone the night before. No reports were ever filed about a missing vehicle. No family came forward looking for a woman and child matching any description. The child himself, they couldn't find any record of him being admitted to any hospital in the county or the surrounding counties. It was as if that ambulance had driven off into the storm and vanished. I requested a transfer to day shift. My supervisor granted it without question, probably saw something in my face that told him pushing back would be a mistake. I've worked road maintenance for another 3 years since that night, but I don't work storms anymore. Can't do it. The moment the snow starts falling heavy, the moment visibility drops and that strange, muffled silence settles over everything, I feel it again. That sensation of being watched, of something paying attention to me with an interest that is neither benign nor malign, but something else entirely. Something that exists outside the categories we use to make sense of the world. I drove past the Hartley property once. About 6 months later, broad daylight, middle of summer, wildflowers blooming in the overgrown fields. The house was gone, not collapsed or burned down, just gone. Where it had stood, there was only an empty foundation slowly being swallowed by vegetation. No charred timbers, no demolition debris, nothing to indicate what had happened to it. I haven't been back since. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about what the child said. I told her you'd come instead. Instead of what? Instead of whom? And why did it matter who came? I don't have answers. I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that somewhere out there, maybe in this world, or maybe in some adjacent space that overlaps with ours under specific conditions, extreme weather, isolation, the right combination of circumstances, there are things waiting, watching, and occasionally, for reasons I can't fathom, they reach out and touch our reality, leaving these strange scars that never quite heal. I still drive the roads. I still do my job. But I don't go out in December snowstorms anymore. Nothing could convince me to do that again. My niece Clara was staying with me the week before Christmas, and I need you to understand something right from the start. I'm not the paranoid type. I don't see danger lurking around every corner. I'm not the kind of person who thinks every stranger is a potential threat. I'm an elementary school teacher, for God's sake. I've spent 15 years working with children and families, building trust, fostering community. I believe in the fundamental goodness of people. But what happened that evening changed something in me. Something fundamental, and even now, 2 years later, I catch myself watching crowds with a vigilance that borders on obsession, scanning faces, noting exit routes, keeping Clara within arm's reach, even in situations where any reasonable person would consider safe. Let me back up and give you the context. My sister Emma and her husband David had planned this trip to Arizona for months, a chance to escape the Vermont winter and visit Emma's college roommate who'd relocated to Scottsdale. They'd offered to take Clara with them, but she'd begged to stay behind. She had friends here, a school Christmas party she didn't want to miss, and honestly, she and I had always been close. Even as a toddler, she'd gravitate toward me at family gatherings, and as she got older, that bond only strengthened. I was the fun aunt, the one who let her stay up a little later than she should, who introduced her to books and movies that were maybe slightly too advanced for her age, who treated her like a capable person rather than a fragile child who needed constant protection. I'd assured Emma and David that it would be fine. I lived just 3 blocks from Clara's school, an easy walk that we could do together every morning and afternoon. My schedule as a teacher meant I was off when she was off. It was perfect, really. A nice week of Aunt niece bonding before the holidays. That Friday was supposed to be special. Our town, Rutland, a mid-sized Vermont community that still maintained that New England charm despite the encroachment of big-box stores and chain restaurants, held its annual tree lighting ceremony every year on the Friday before Christmas. It was a genuine event, something the whole community turned out for. The town square would be transformed into this winter wonderland, with local carolers, vendors selling hot cocoa and cider, booths where local artisans sold handmade crafts. The mayor would give a speech that was usually equal parts heartfelt and cheesy, and then at exactly 7 p.m. they'd flip the switch and the massive Douglas fir in the center of the square would light up with thousands of white lights while a choir sang, "O Holy Night." Clara had been talking about it all week. She'd attended the year before with her parents and had apparently found it magical, which, to be honest, it was. There's something about those community holiday traditions, especially in small New England towns, that captures a specific kind of nostalgia and wonder that's increasingly rare in our modern world. But weather, as it often does in Vermont, had other plans. Around 3 hours that afternoon, I started noticing the snow. Not unusual. It had been snowing on and off for days, light dustings that barely accumulated. But this was different. These were big, heavy flakes, the kind that fall straight down without any wind, that stick to everything they touch. By 4 the roads were showing significant accumulation. By 5 my phone was buzzing with the emergency alert. The tree lighting ceremony had been officially cancelled due to weather conditions. I'd expected Clara to be devastated. She was 6 years old, had been looking forward to this for a week, and I was already mentally preparing my speech about how we'd do something special next year. How sometimes things don't work out the way we plan, but we make the best of it. But she took the news with more grace than I expected. Her face fell, sure, and her bottom lip jutted out in a pout that was impossible not to find endearing. But she didn't cry, didn't throw a tantrum, just nodded and said, "Okay." That's when I got the idea about the tree lot. There was this little pop-up Christmas tree operation that's set up every year in a cleared lot near the hardware store, maybe 4 blocks from my apartment. Nothing fancy, just a fenced-in space with rows of trees leaned up against wooden supports, a small heated shed where they processed payments, and strings of lights that gave the whole place a warm, nostalgic glow. I'd passed it dozens of times but had never actually stopped, having always got my tree from one of the big garden centers on the highway. "Listen," I told Clara, crouching down to her level. "I know it's not the big ceremony, but what if we went and picked out a tree? Just you and me. We could get hot chocolate afterward, and we'd have the whole rest of the evening to decorate it." Her eyes lit up, that sudden transformation from disappointed to excited that children do so effortlessly, and she nodded enthusiastically. "Can we get a really tall one?" "We can get whatever tree speaks to you," I told her, already pulling on my winter coat. We bundled up. And I mean really bundled up. Vermont winters aren't something you take lightly. Clara wore thermals under her jeans, a heavy sweater, her winter coat, a hat, mittens, and a scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes were visible. I did similarly, adding the kind of serious winter boots that could handle deep snow. The walk to the tree lot was actually beautiful. The snow had transformed the familiar streets into something ethereal, muffled sounds, soft edges, everything outlined in white. Clara ran ahead, stopping every few feet to examine snowflakes that had landed on her mittens or to make fresh footprints in undisturbed snow. I followed at a more sedate pace, keeping her within sight but giving her enough space to enjoy herself. The streets were largely empty. Most sensible people had decided to stay inside, and the few vehicles we did see were moving slowly, cautiously. The storm had that strange quality of making everything feel paused, suspended, like we'd stepped into a snow globe someone had shaken and then left sitting on a shelf. When we arrived at the tree lot, I was pleased to see they were still open despite the weather. The lights were on, casting that warm yellow glow across the snow-covered lot, and I could see a few other families moving between the rows of trees. Not crowded, but not deserted either. Just enough activity to make it feel festive rather than lonely. Clara was off like a shot the moment we stepped through the gate, darting between trees with that boundless energy that seems to be the exclusive domain of 6-year-olds. She'd call out to me every few seconds. "Aunt Rachel, what about this one?" "No, wait, this one." "No, this one." And I'd respond appropriately, playing up my consideration of each candidate, even though they all looked more or less the same to me. I kept close enough to hear her, close enough to respond to her calls, but I let her explore. She needed this, I thought. After the disappointment of the cancelled ceremony, this sense of agency, of choosing something important, was good for her. There was a man working the lot, mid-30s maybe, heavy coat, beard, the kind of weathered face that suggested a lot of time spent outdoors. He was helping a couple load a tree onto the roof of their car, and he caught my eye as I walked past the payment shed. "Evening," he called out. "Finding everything okay?" "Yes, thanks," I responded. "Just browsing." "Let me know if you need help moving anything. Some of these are heavier than they look." I nodded, appreciating the offer, but focused on keeping track of Clara's bright pink hat bobbing between the trees. I turned toward the payment shed, intending to ask about prices, and that's when I heard Clara's voice again. But this time, there was something different about it. Not frightened exactly, but uncertain. "Aunt Rachel." I turned back, scanning the rows. "Yeah. Sweetie? Can you come here?" There was definitely something in her tone now that made my protective instincts kick in. I walked quickly toward where I thought her voice had come from, rounding a row of larger trees. She was gone. Not just out of sight, gone. The row where I'd seen her hat just moments before was empty, the snow between the trees undisturbed except for a few sets of adult footprints from earlier customers. "Clara!" I called out, my voice sharper now, carrying across the lot. No response. I walked faster, checking the next row, the one after that. The lot wasn't that big. Maybe 50 yards on a side with 8 or 10 rows of trees. There was nowhere she could have gone that would put her completely out of sight. "Clara!" Louder now, not caring who I disturbed. That's when I saw them, footprints in the snow. Small ones, Clara's size, leading from the row of trees toward the edge of the lot. But next to them, overlapping them in places, were larger prints. Adult-sized. Someone had been walking beside her, close enough that their footprints merged, and the tracks led out of the lot toward the sidewalk. My heart dropped into my stomach. That sensation you get when you're on a roller coaster and it crests the hill and drops. Except this didn't stop. This just kept falling, kept dropping, adrenaline flooding my system so fast I felt momentarily dizzy. I ran toward the sidewalk, boots slipping on the packed snow, nearly going down once but catching myself. I hit the sidewalk and looked both directions, scanning frantically. There, half a block down, under a streetlight, I saw them. Clara was walking beside a man. A tall man in a dark coat, hood pulled up. His arm was down at his side, and at first glance, it looked completely innocent. Just a man and a child walking together. But I could see, even at this distance, that he had her by the wrist. Not violently, not dragging her, just maintaining contact in a way that looked casual unless you knew to look for it. Clara's posture was all wrong. She wasn't skipping or bouncing the way she normally moved. She was walking stiffly, mechanically, like a puppet being guided. I screamed her name. Clara! Everything seemed to happen in slow motion and incredibly fast simultaneously. Clara's head whipped around so quickly I saw her hood fly back. Even at this distance, I could see her eyes widen. The man stopped walking. He didn't turn toward me, didn't look at me, just stopped. I was already running, boots pounding on the sidewalk, arms pumping, screaming her name over and over. Clara, let go of him! Clara, come here right now! Other people were starting to notice. A woman coming out of the corner store, a man getting into his car, the tree lot guy emerging from his shed. But I didn't care about them. I didn't care about making a scene or looking crazy. I just needed to get to Clara. The man still hadn't turned toward me. He was just standing there, completely still, while Clara started pulling her arm, trying to yank herself free. I could see her mouth moving, could see her starting to struggle in earnest. I closed the distance fast. 20 feet, 15, 10. I was screaming at him now, words that were probably incoherent, just noise and fury and terror given voice. At 5 feet, Clara suddenly jerked her arm one more time and her wrist slipped free of his grip. She bolted toward me, running with that frantic, uncoordinated sprint that children do when they're truly frightened, and I dropped to my knees in the snow to catch her. She hit me with enough force to nearly knock me over, and I wrapped my arms around her, holding her so tightly that she made a small squeaking sound. I could feel her trembling, full body shakes that spoke to genuine fear. It's okay, I heard myself saying, over and over like a mantra. It's okay, I've got you, it's okay. I looked up. The man was walking away, not running, not even walking quickly, just a normal walking pace, moving down the sidewalk like nothing had happened. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run even colder than it already was. There was a second man. He'd been standing behind the bus shelter, maybe 15 feet away, completely out of sight until he stepped forward. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, just standing there, hands in his pockets, watching. And as the first man walked past him, they exchanged a glance. No words, no gestures, just a look. Then they both continued walking in the same direction, side by side, two men out for an evening stroll. That coordination, that silent communication, it spoke to planning, to practice, to something that had been rehearsed. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone when I pulled it out to call 911. Clara was still pressed against me, face buried in my coat, and I kept one arm locked around her while I dialed with numb fingers. The 911 operator answered on the second ring, and I gave her everything I could. Location, description of both men, direction they were walking, what had happened. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high and too fast, words tumbling over each other. The tree lot guy, whose name I later learned was Marcus, had run over and was standing protectively beside us, his own phone out and his eyes locked on the two figures who were now nearly a block away, about to turn a corner. "Did you see that?" I asked him, needing confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. "I saw it," he said grimly. "I'm on the phone with police too. They're sending units now." Clara was crying now, quiet sobs that shook her small frame. I pulled her back slightly, just enough to see her face, and asked her the question I was dreading. "Sweetie, what happened? How did you end up with that man?" She hiccuped, wiped at her eyes with her mitten, and said in a voice so small I barely heard it, "He said he needed help finding his dog. He showed me a picture on his phone. I was going to help him look, and then he took my hand and said we had to go to his car." She dissolved into tears again, and I pulled her back against me, rocking slightly while I processed what she'd said. The oldest trick in the book. The lost pet. Of course. Children want to help, want to be kind, and a lost pet bypasses so many of their normal safety instincts. And he'd moved fast enough, smoothly enough, that she'd been out of the lot and down the sidewalk before she'd even fully processed what was happening. The police arrived within minutes. 2 squad cars that pulled up with lights flashing, but no sirens. Officers spread out quickly, getting statements, calling in the descriptions of the 2 men. One officer, a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, knelt down to Clara's level and spoke to her gently, asking if she'd be willing to answer some questions. Clara, to her credit, nodded. She was still crying, still trembling, but she told the officer everything she could remember. The man had been nice at first, she said, smiley, but when he took her hand, it hurt. Not a lot, but enough that she knew something was wrong. And then she'd heard me yelling, and she'd known she needed to get away. The officer asked her about the man's voice, his appearance, anything distinctive. Clara mentioned his eyes, said they looked wrong somehow. When pressed, she couldn't articulate what she meant, just kept saying they didn't look right. One of the other officers came over to speak to his colleague in low tones I wasn't meant to overhear, but I caught enough. Matches the pattern from Montpellier. 2-man team, same general approach. Pattern, team, same approach. The officer who'd been interviewing Clara stood up and came over to me, and what she told me next is something that still keeps me awake at night. Ma'am, I need you to understand something. You calling out like you did, making a scene, not letting this go, that likely saved your niece's life, or at least saved her from something very traumatic. We've been tracking reports from across Vermont and into New Hampshire about possible abduction attempts following this exact pattern. 2 men working in tandem. One approaches children directly, while the second hangs back, out of sight. If someone intervenes and the first man has to break off, both men walk away in opposite directions, makes it harder to give chase, harder to track. But if no one intervenes, the second man brings a vehicle around and they're gone before anyone realizes something's wrong. She paused, making sure I was really hearing her. The differential descriptions witnesses give, different heights, different builds, different clothing, it's intentional. They know that if someone eventually reports it, the descriptions will be confused and contradictory. It's a very sophisticated operation, and we've been trying to identify these individuals for weeks. Have they... I couldn't finish the question. We don't have any confirmed abductions yet, she said carefully. Just several attempted ones that were interrupted. But the attempts are getting more frequent, and they're getting bolder. This is the first time they've tried something in a location with this much potential foot traffic. She gave me her card, took my contact information, and told me someone from the detective division would likely want to speak with us again in the coming days. She also gave me the name of a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Just as a precaution, she said, though we both knew it was more than that. We didn't get a tree that night. Marcus, the tree lot guy, brought one to my apartment the next day, a beautiful 7-foot Fraser fir that he refused to accept payment for. On the house, he said gruffly. Glad she's okay. That was 2 years ago. Clara's 8 now, nearly 9. She still flinches when she hears a dog bark, still gets nervous around men she doesn't know, still has nightmares sometimes. We've done therapy, lots of it, and she's resilient in the way children often are. But there are scars, invisible ones, but real nonetheless. I moved to a different neighborhood a few months after the incident, sold my condo and found a place in a more populated area, closer to the school, on a street with lots of families where someone is always outside, always watching. I don't let Clara walk anywhere alone anymore, even short distances. Some people probably think I'm overprotective, that I'm damaging her independence, that I'm letting fear dictate my parenting. They weren't there that night. They didn't see how close it was. They didn't see the coordination between those 2 men, the practiced efficiency of it. They didn't hear the officer's careful non-answer when I asked if any children had been taken. The police never caught them, The investigation is technically still open, but I can read between the lines when the detective calls with updates that aren't really updates. They're gone. Either moved on to other locations or gone to ground, waiting for attention to die down. Sometimes I wonder about the children who weren't as lucky as Clara. The ones whose aunts or parents didn't yell quickly enough, didn't make enough of a scene, didn't trust their instincts when something felt wrong. I wonder where they are now, what happened to them, whether they're even still alive. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at missing children reports from across New England, scanning the faces, reading the details of their disappearances. Trying to find patterns, trying to see connections, trying to do something, anything, to make sense of the fact that there are people out there who look at a 6-year-old girl and see an opportunity. Clara still loves Christmas, still gets excited about decorations and presents and all the trappings of the holiday. But she doesn't like snow anymore. When it starts falling, she gets quiet, withdrawn, and she stays close to me. Closer than is probably healthy for a child her age. The tree lighting ceremony in our town is next week. We're not going. That winter, I stayed back in Bellevue while my parents flew out to Tucson to see my grandmother. They'd asked me multiple times if I was sure I didn't want to come along. "You sure, honey? It's going to be cold here, so Grandma would love to see you." But I'd insisted I was fine. The truth was, I'd just started working at this small gas station off Route 49, and the owner, Frank, had made it very clear that he needed coverage for the holiday shifts. Let me tell you a bit about Frank. He was in his mid-60s, had owned this particular gas station for something like 30 years, and he ran it with the kind of anxious micromanagement that suggested he'd never quite accepted that sometimes things would go wrong no matter how much you worried about them. Every shift started with a 10-minute briefing about proper register procedures, correct stocking techniques, and the absolute importance of checking IDs for alcohol purchases, even if the customer was clearly 70 years old. He had lists for everything, laminated checklists hanging on every wall, and a binder the size of a phone book filled with protocols for various scenarios. But he paid minimum wage, plus a shift differential for evenings and weekends. He paid on time, and he didn't ask too many questions when I'd shown up looking for work after dropping out of community college halfway through my second semester. So I put up with his quirks and tried to be a reliable employee. The gas station itself was nothing special. One of those generic roadside stops that exist in the thousands across America. 2 banks of pumps under a flickering canopy. A small convenience store with the usual array of chips and candy and drinks. A bathroom that was perpetually sketchy no matter how many times I cleaned it, and a coffee station that dispensed liquid that bore only a passing resemblance to actual coffee. We got a mix of regulars, local contractors grabbing coffee before dawn, truckers refueling on long hauls, the occasional tourist who'd taken a wrong turn off the interstate, and the anonymous flow of travelers who stopped once and would never be seen again. Frank had described Christmas Eve as potentially apocalyptic. "Everyone waiting until the last minute," he'd said darkly. "Desperate people buying last-minute gifts, families driving to relatives' houses who forgot to fuel up beforehand. It's chaos. Pure chaos." So when he'd asked if I could work the closing shift, 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., I'd said yes. Extra holiday pay, and honestly, I didn't have anywhere else to be. My parents wouldn't be back for another week, and spending Christmas Eve alone in my apartment sounded more depressing than spending it at the gas station. The day the big storm rolled in, things had been quiet. Unseasonably quiet, actually. The morning shift worker, a perpetually stoned guy named Derek, had texted me around 3 p.m. to say he'd maybe seen 5 customers all day. The weather reports had been increasingly alarming, talking about whiteout conditions, ice accumulation, and strongly advising people to stay home and off the roads. When I arrived for my shift at 6:45 p.m., Derek couldn't get out of there fast enough. He gave me the quickest turnover in history. Registers counted, coffees made, bathrooms are gross, good luck, and was in his car before I'd even taken my coat off. Looking back, I should have asked Frank if I could close early. Should have insisted, actually. The snow was already coming down steadily, those big, heavy flakes that seem innocent at first but accumulate with remarkable speed. The roads were getting slick. I'd fishtailed twice on the drive over, and the temperature was dropping fast enough that I could watch the numbers fall on the outdoor thermometer. But I was 20 years old, invincible in the way that young people often are, and I'd committed to the shift. Frank was paying me time and a half for holiday work. I'd tough it out. For the first 2 hours, I had a trickle of customers, maybe one every 20 or 30 minutes. People grabbing last-minute items, filling their tanks before hunkering down for the night. They'd come in stamping snow off their boots, complain about the weather, grab what they needed, and leave. Normal interactions that required nothing from me beyond basic customer service. By 9 p.m., though, that trickle had dried up completely. The storm had intensified significantly. I could barely see the road anymore through the front windows, just an undifferentiated wall of white. The wind had picked up too, making the gas station's metal awnings creak and groan in a way that was probably structurally sound, but sounded ominous as hell. I busied myself with closing tasks, counted the register down. We'd made maybe $300 all day, a tiny fraction of what Frank had predicted. Cleaned the coffee station, mopped the floors, restocked the coolers. Small, repetitive tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind from dwelling on how isolated I was out here. The radio behind the counter kept chirping out weather updates, each one more dire than the last. Winter storm warning upgraded to blizzard warning. Travel not recommended. Emergency services response times delayed. Stay home if at all possible. I was debating whether to call Frank and ask permission to close up early. Probably should have done it an hour ago, when I saw headlights cut through the snow. A car was pulling into the lot, moving slowly, carefully. It turned toward the pumps, and the headlights illuminated it clearly for a moment before it passed out of direct view. An old sedan, dull gray color, boxy style that screamed 1990s. It looked worn, the kind of car held together by duct tape and prayer. Out of place even in our gas station lot, which regularly hosted some pretty sketchy vehicles. The car stopped at pump 3. The engine shut off, but the driver didn't get out immediately. Just sat there, a vague shape visible through the snow-covered windows. I watched through the front window, waiting. Most people came inside to prepay. Our pumps were ancient and didn't have card readers built in. But this person just sat there, unmoving. A minute passed, then another. I was starting to wonder if they'd just pulled in to wait out the worst of the storm when the driver's door finally opened. The man who stepped out wasn't dressed for the weather. He had a heavy dark coat, sure, but no gloves, no hat, and I could see his hands from inside the store, red and raw looking even from this distance. He moved quickly, urgently, shoulders hunched against the snow, and headed straight for the store entrance. The door chimed as he entered, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and a swirl of snowflakes. He didn't say anything, didn't give me the usual greeting or nod that most customers offered. Just brushed snow off his shoulders with those bare red hands and made a beeline for the coolers in the back. "Evening," I called out, trying for friendly but probably landing somewhere closer to nervous. Something about him had immediately set off my internal alarm bells. Nothing I could point to specifically, just an aggregate of small details that didn't add up quite right. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. Just walked straight to the back of the store and stopped in front of the soda coolers, staring at the glass door like it contained the secrets of the universe. He stood there, and stood there. Not moving, not opening the door, not looking at different options, just staring at the glass door with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. His posture was odd too rigid, like a mannequin positioned by someone who'd only ever seen humans in photographs. I watched him for what was probably 30 seconds but felt like 5 minutes, trying to decide if I should ask if he needed help. The rational part of my brain said he was probably just cold, maybe a little out of it, possibly had some kind of medical condition or disability that affected his behavior. The lizard part of my brain was screaming that something was wrong, that his stillness was predatory, that I needed to be very, very careful. He suddenly turned away from the coolers without opening them and started walking toward the counter. Toward me, still empty-handed, still moving with that strange, rigid quality. He stopped on the customer side of the counter, not quite close enough to lean on it, but close enough that I took an involuntary step backward. From this distance, I could see details I'd missed before. The chapped skin around his knuckles that looked like it might be bleeding in places, the way his coat was zipped all the way up despite the overheated interior of the store, the fact that his face was completely expressionless, not angry or sad or neutral, just blank. Like a mask. "How long do you stay open?" His voice was flat, without effect or intonation. Not unfriendly, exactly, but completely devoid of the normal social cues that make human interaction work. "We close at 11, I told him, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. 2 more hours. Just 2 more hours, and I could lock up and leave." His eyes, and I didn't want to look directly at them, but I forced myself, were a pale blue, almost gray. They didn't blink as much as they should have, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You're here alone?" he asked. And here's where I made the stupid mistake that I've regretted ever since. The mistake that, in any other context, with any other person, would have been perfectly fine, but in this moment was potentially catastrophic. "Yes," I said. Just that. One word. Confirming that I was alone, that there was no one in the back room, no manager about to appear, no co-worker arriving for the next shift. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, just a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth that suggested satisfaction, confirmation of something he'd suspected. "Brave," he said, and that single word carried weight I didn't like. Most people aren't this far out alone at night. Then, without buying anything, without explaining why he'd come in, he turned and walked back out. The door chimed. The blast of cold air hit me again, and through the front window, I watched him get back in his car and drive away, taillights disappearing into the wall of snow. I stood there behind the counter, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I'd overreacted. He was just a weird guy. Weird wasn't illegal. Weird wasn't dangerous. Lots of people were socially awkward or bad at normal interaction. It didn't mean anything, but my hands were shaking and I couldn't seem to make them stop. I walked over to the door and flipped the lock. Fuck Frank's protocols and official closing time. I wasn't staying here unlocked with that guy potentially in the area. The next hour passed in tense silence. I busied myself with more closing tasks, constantly glancing out the windows, jumping at every creak and groan of the building settling. The storm was fully raging now. Visibility had dropped to maybe 10 feet, and the wind was strong enough that it occasionally rocked my car in the parking lot. At 10:15, I decided to close up early. Frank would understand, or he wouldn't, but either way, I wasn't waiting until 11. I'd shut off the exterior lights, count out the register, and be in my car in 15 minutes. That's when I heard it. A sound from the back of the building, from the storage room that led to the rear exit, a heavy metal door that we kept chained from the inside because the lock had been broken for months, and Frank was too cheap to get it properly repaired. Tapping. Not loud, not aggressive, just this dull, slow, deliberate tapping, like someone knocking with their knuckles. Tap, 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 regular intervals, patient, methodical. I froze, standing in the middle of the store with the mop still in my hands, listening. The tapping stopped. I waited, barely breathing, counting my own heartbeats. Then came a new sound. A dragging, scraping sound, like something heavy being pulled across the exterior wall. It moved slowly from right to left, from the door toward the side of the building, and I could track its progress by sound alone. Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart under scrutiny. It wasn't wind, too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't a branch. Nothing dragged a branch horizontally across a wall like that. It wasn't an animal. What animal would behave that way in a blizzard? The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I very quietly set down the mop and walked toward the storage room, moving as silently as I could. The door was closed. I was certain I'd left it open earlier, but now it was shut tight. I put my hand on the knob, hesitated, then very slowly turned it until I heard the click of the latch disengaging. I pulled the door open an inch, 2 inches. The storage room was dark, lit only by the dim red glow of the exit sign above the back door. Shelves of inventory cast strange shadows, and the chain on the back door was... The chain was pulled taut, not hanging loose the way it should have been, but stretched tight, rattling slightly, like something on the other side was pulling at the door. I slammed the storage room door shut, locked it from my side, thank God there was at least an interior lock, and backed away. My phone was in my pocket. I pulled it out with trembling hands and called Frank, not caring that I was probably waking him up, not caring about anything except that I needed someone to know what was happening. He answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep. "This better be important." "Frank, someone's outside the building. Someone's trying the back door, I think." Slow down," he said, and I could hear him sitting up, becoming more alert. "What's going on?" I explained as calmly as I could. The weird customer, the sounds from the back, the chain being pulled. To his credit, Frank didn't dismiss me or suggest I was overreacting. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "Lock yourself in the bathroom if you need to. I'm calling the sheriff's department right now. Stay on the line with me." I could hear him on another phone, talking to someone, giving them the address. The sheriff's dispatcher apparently told him they'd send someone as soon as possible, but response times were severely delayed due to the storm. Could be 15 minutes, could be an hour. "I'm going to drive over too," Frank said, back on the line with me. "But it's going to take me a bit. Roads are bad. Can you stay calm? Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm in the main store area," I told him. "The back storage room is locked. I haven't heard anything else since I called you." "Good, that's good. Just stay where you are. Stay away from the windows and..." The store phone rang. Not my cell phone. The landline behind the counter that customers sometimes called if they needed directions or wanted to ask if we had a specific product in stock. I stared at it, listening to it ring. Once. Twice. "Someone's calling the store phone," I told Frank. "Don't answer it," he said immediately. "Just let it ring." But I was already moving toward it, something compulsive overriding common sense. I needed to know, needed to see who was calling. I picked up the receiver, held it to my ear but didn't speak. Silence on the other end. Not dead air. I could tell the line was active. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels occupied. Like someone is there but choosing not to speak. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. Breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations. And then a voice, barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have lied." I hung up. Nearly through the phone, actually, my hands suddenly slick with sweat despite the cold. "What?" Frank was saying through my cell phone. "What happened?" "Someone just... They called and said I lied. I don't understand." Even as I said it, though, I did understand. The man had asked if I was alone, and I'd said yes. And now he was telling me that was a lie, which meant he thought there was someone else here, or knew there wasn't and was playing games, or... My thought process derailed as I heard it again. The dragging sound, but this time from the front of the building, moving along the exterior wall that faced the parking lot, passing right below the windows of the main store area. I dropped into a crouch behind the counter, trying to make myself as small as possible. Frank was talking urgently through my phone, but I couldn't process his words anymore. All my attention was focused on the sound of something moving outside the building, circling slowly, methodically. Then the power went out. Not flickering, not browning out, just instantly, completely cut. The fluorescent lights died, the refrigerator units shut down mid-hum, the radio went silent. The only illumination came from the dim red exit sign in the back and the faint gray glow from the snow outside. I fumbled with my phone, trying to activate the flashlight with shaking fingers. The screen provided minimal light, just enough to see a few feet in front of me. "The power's out," I whispered to Frank. "Shit. Okay, that's probably just the storm. Lines are down all over. Do you have a flashlight there?" Frank would have insisted on emergency supplies. There should be a flashlight somewhere behind the counter. I felt around in the dark, running my hands along the shelves under the register. Found a metal cylinder that had to be a flashlight, located the button, pressed it. The beam clicked on, strong and steady. I stood up slowly, playing the light around the store. Everything looked normal. Empty aisles, dark coolers, unmoved merchandise. I swung the beam toward the front windows and immediately wished I hadn't. There were no tracks in the snow. None. The parking lot outside, including the area right in front of the store where someone would have had to walk to make those dragging sounds, was completely pristine. Unmarked except for my car and the drifts blown by the wind. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing to indicate anyone had been near the building at all. "Frank," I said, and my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "There's no one outside. There are no tracks in the snow. But I heard..." "Stay calm," he said, but his voice had taken on a different quality now. Uncertainty. "Just stay where you are. Help is coming." The dragging sound started again, this time from directly overhead, like someone was walking on the roof, pulling something heavy across the metal surface. I looked up reflexively, tracking the sound as it moved from one end of the building to the other. The ceiling tiles gave me nothing, just standard acoustic panels, water-stained and old, but otherwise unremarkable. Frank was saying something, but I'd stopped listening. All my attention was fixed on a sound that shouldn't have been possible, the sound of the back storage room door opening. I'd locked it. I was absolutely certain I'd locked it, but I heard the distinctive creak of its hinges, heard the way it scraped slightly against the floor at the bottom. "The storage room door just opened," I said into the phone. And even to my own ears, my voice sounded distant, disconnected. Without conscious thought, I was moving, grabbing my coat and keys, heading for the front door. I wasn't staying here another second, wasn't waiting for help to arrive. Whatever was happening, whatever was outside or inside or in between, I was done. I fumbled with the door lock, got it open, and nearly slipped on the ice immediately outside. Caught myself on the door frame, regained my balance, and ran for my car. The snow was past my ankles, making every step a struggle. My car was maybe 30 feet away, but felt like a mile. I could hear Frank yelling through my phone, still clutched in my hand somehow, but I couldn't make out the words over the wind and my own gasping breath. I reached my car, yanked the door open, threw myself inside. Locked the doors with a desperation that was probably irrational but felt absolutely necessary. Started the engine. Come on, and felt almost light-headed with relief when it turned over on the first try. Only then, with the engine running and the heater starting to blow cold air that would eventually turn warm, did I bring the phone back to my ear. "Are you there? Answer me. Where are you?" "I'm in my car," I managed to say. "I'm leaving." "Wait for the sheriff. They're almost—" "I'm not waiting. I'm leaving right now." And I did. Put the car in drive and pulled out of that parking lot with more speed than was remotely safe given the conditions. Fishtailed onto Route 49 corrected and drove through the storm with my hands locked on the wheel and my eyes fixed straight ahead. I drove to the sheriff's station. Didn't go home. Didn't go to Frank's house. Drove straight to the station and sat in their parking lot until a deputy came out to see why I was sitting there at nearly midnight in a blizzard. I gave a statement. They sent a unit to check on the gas station. Everything was normal, they reported. Power was out due to storm damage to a local transformer, but that was affecting several businesses in the area. No signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been near the building. The back storage room door? I'd clearly forgotten to lock it, the deputy suggested gently. Easy mistake when you're stressed. The phone call, probably a wrong number or someone's idea of a prank. The sounds? Old buildings make strange noises, especially in high winds. I quit that night, called Frank the next morning and told him I wasn't coming back, that he could mail my last paycheck or I'd pick it up when I was ready, but I wasn't setting foot in that gas station again. He tried to convince me to reconsider, said I'd just gotten spooked, that working alone at night could be unnerving, but nothing had actually happened. Nothing had actually happened. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was all explainable. Storm sounds and old plumbing and my own overactive imagination combining into something that felt like danger but wasn't. But I remember the voice on that phone call. "You shouldn't have lied." And I remember checking the snow outside the windows and seeing no tracks, nothing to explain the sounds that had been coming from outside the building. Most of all, I remember the feeling, that absolute certainty that something was outside, that it was circling, that it knew I was alone and vulnerable. I never worked another closing shift anywhere. Found a new job at a grocery store, day shifts only, always with multiple co-workers around. I don't stay anywhere alone after dark in December anymore. Won't do it. Can't do it. Because whether what happened that night was real or imagined, explainable or supernatural, it fundamentally changed something in me. Broke some basic assumption about safety that I didn't even know I'd been carrying. And on nights when the snow falls heavy and the wind picks up, when I'm safe in my apartment with the doors locked and the lights on, I still sometimes hear it, that slow, deliberate dragging sound, like something patient and persistent circling endlessly, waiting for another chance. I'd picked up this short-term security gig for some extra cash before the holidays, and honestly, I didn't think much of it at the time. Just seemed like easy money. A few weeks of work, decent pay, minimal responsibilities. I'd just finished my associate degree in criminal justice and was trying to figure out what came next. Police academy? Private security long-term? Maybe something completely different. I was 23. Directionless in that way that people in their early 20s often are, and a temporary job in northern Idaho sounded like as good a plan as any. The property was this upscale cabin retreat, the kind of place where wealthy people from Seattle or Portland came to rough it in 5,000-square-foot log homes with heated floors and wine cellars. The company that owned it rented the cabins out during peak seasons and kept a small maintenance crew on site year-round to handle upkeep. During winter, they wanted security on the property overnight to monitor weather conditions, keep an eye on the equipment, and make sure nobody wandered off drunk into the forest and froze to death. Most of the job was bureaucratic checkbox ticking. Walk the property once an hour, log any issues, monitor the camera feeds, respond to any emergencies. In the 3 weeks I'd been there, the most exciting thing that had happened was a breaker that had tripped in cabin 8, requiring me to trudge through shin-deep snow to reset it. That winter had been brutal even by northern Idaho standards. The snow had started in early November and hadn't really stopped. Just wave after wave of storms. each dumping anywhere from 6 to 20 inches. By mid-December, the property looked like something from a fantasy novel. Trees bent under the weight of accumulated snow, drift that reached the second-story windows of some cabins, a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful and hostile. A few days before Christmas, the really big storm rolled in, the kind of storm that made the local news, that had meteorologists using terms like historic accumulation and potentially life-threatening conditions. Management made the call to evacuate all non-essential staff before the worst of it hit. The site manager, Keith, a perpetually stressed man in his late 40s who took his responsibilities very seriously, called me that afternoon. Most of the crew had already left, he said. The last few stragglers were heading out within the hour, but he needed someone to stay at the main lodge and monitor the security cameras until the storm passed. "It's probably just going to be one night," he assured me. "Two at most. The forecast says it should blow through pretty quick. I just need someone there to keep an eye on things, make sure none of the roofs collapse under the snow load, that kind of thing. You'd be alone except for one other temp, Darren, who's on the schedule for overnight patrol anyway. You two can coordinate." He offered to pay me double time for the duration of the storm. My apartment back in town, a basement studio in a converted house that had heating issues and a persistent damp smell, didn't exactly call to me. The main lodge, on the other hand, had a massive stone fireplace, a fully stocked kitchen, and actual insulation. "I'll do it," I said. Keith sounded relieved. Great. There's a protocol binder in the office. Just follow the procedures if anything comes up. You've got my number if you need anything, but honestly, you'll probably be bored out of your mind. Just hang out, stay warm, and keep an eye on the monitors. Darren arrived for his shift around 6 p.m. I didn't know him well. We'd overlapped a few times during shift changes, but had never had an extended conversation. He was in his late 20s, quiet, the kind of person who seemed comfortable with silence. Not unfriendly, just self-contained. We heated up some leftover pasta from the staff fridge and ate together at the large wooden table in the lodge's main room, making the kind of small talk that co-workers who don't really know each other make. After dinner, he geared up for his patrol, heavy coat, insulated boots, a high-powered flashlight, and a radio clipped to his belt. The protocol was for him to do a circuit of the property once an hour, checking on all the cabins, looking for any issues that needed immediate attention. "I'll start with the perimeter cabins and work my way back," he said, pulling on his gloves. "Should take me about 45 minutes for a full loop. Keep the radio on channel 3. I'll check in if I see anything weird." "Sounds good," I said. "I'll be watching the cameras." He stepped out into the storm and I locked the door behind him. Standard procedure. Then I settled into the back office where the security monitors were set up. The system was fairly basic but adequate. A dozen cameras positioned around the property, feeding into a central monitoring station with multiple screens. Most of the views showed the same thing. Swirling snow, dark shapes of cabins barely visible through the blizzard, trees bending under the wind. The cameras had night vision capability, which gave everything this strange greenish cast that made the familiar property look alien. By 8 p.m., the storm had intensified significantly. The wind was constant now, not gusting, but maintaining a steady roar that I could hear even through the lodge's thick walls. Snow wasn't just falling, it was being driven horizontally, accumulating at a rate I could actually observe on the cameras. Drifts were forming against the cabin walls, slowly climbing higher. Darren had checked in twice via radio, once from cabin cluster A, once from the maintenance shed near the property line. His voice had been steady, professional, reporting no issues. Then, around 8:30, the radio crackled. "Cabin 6's back door's open. Looks like it blew in from the wind. I'm going to secure it." Cabin 6 was one of the farthest from the main lodge, tucked into the tree line at the eastern edge of the property, about a quarter-mile away. It was a popular cabin despite, or maybe because of, its isolation. People who wanted the authentic wilderness experience specifically requested it. "Need any backup?" I asked, keying the radio. "Nah, I've got it. Should be quick." That was the last I heard from him. At first, I didn't think anything of it. He'd said it would be quick, and I assumed he was just dealing with the door, maybe doing a sweep inside to make sure the wind hadn't damaged anything. I went back to watching the monitors, occasionally glancing at the clock. 9 Corps came and went. No radio check-in. 9:15, nothing. At 9:30, I tried radioing him. "Darren, this is base. What's your status?" Static. I tried again. "Darren, please respond." More static, with maybe, I couldn't be sure, a faint sound underneath it, like wind or breathing or interference from the storm. That's when I noticed something wrong with the camera feeds. They were freezing. Not all at once. That would have been obvious. But gradually, one screen at a time, the live feed would pause on a single frame. The timestamp would stop updating. The image would become static. At first, I thought it was the storm interfering with the signal. Weather can do that. Heavy precipitation, wind, ice accumulation on the equipment. But as I watched, more cameras dropped out. Cabin Cluster B, the maintenance shed. The North Trail. The power in the lodge was still fine. Lights on, heaters running, no flickering. The monitors themselves were working. It was just the feeds that were dying. I tried rebooting the system, went through the shutdown and restart procedure outlined in the binder. Most of the cameras came back, but not all of them. Cabin 6's feed in particular flickered once and then locked on a single frame. The image showed the interior hallway of the cabin, a narrow corridor with pine-paneled walls leading from the main living area toward the bedrooms. The camera was positioned near the ceiling, angled to cover the entry and most of the hallway. In the frozen frame, I could see part of the entryway rug and the beginning of the hallway. Nothing unusual. Just an empty hallway and an empty cabin, except Darren should have been there. He'd said he was going to secure the door, which meant he should have been visible on that camera at some point. But I hadn't seen him enter on the feed, and now the feed was frozen. I tried the radio again. "Darren, I've lost some camera feeds. Can you confirm your location?" Nothing. Not even static this time. Just dead air, like the channel wasn't even open. I pulled out my cell phone. No signal. Not unusual up here. The property had spotty coverage in good weather, and during heavy storms, it was basically non-existent. There was a landline in the office, though. I picked up the receiver. Dead. Completely dead. No dial tone, no hiss of an open line. Just silence. Okay, don't panic. This was all explainable. Storm had probably taken out a cell tower and a phone line. It happened all the time in this kind of weather. Darren had probably just gone into cabin 6 where the walls blocked the radio signal, and he'd check in once he came back outside. But it had been over an hour since his last transmission. An hour since he'd said he was going to quickly secure a door. I stared at the frozen camera feed from cabin 6, willing it to update, to show me Darren walking down that hallway or securing the door or doing anything that would confirm he was okay. The image didn't change. Just that empty hallway, frozen in time. At 10:15, I made a decision. I was going out there. I knew it was stupid even as I made the choice. Every protocol, every bit of training, every horror movie I'd ever seen said, don't go wandering around alone in a blizzard when you've lost contact with your partner and the power is acting weird. Call for help. Wait for backup. Don't be the idiot who goes to investigate. But I couldn't just sit there. If Darren was in trouble, if he'd slipped on ice and injured himself, if he'd gotten disoriented in the storm, every minute mattered. Hypothermia could set in fast in these conditions. I geared up, insulated coveralls over my clothes, heavy parka, boots rated to 40 below, gloves, a face mask that covered everything except my eyes, and 2 flashlights, one handheld, one headlamp. I grabbed the radio, even though it hadn't been working, and I left a note on the desk. Gone to cabin 6, 10:17 p.m. Stepping outside was like stepping into another world. The cold was immediate and total, finding every gap in my clothing within seconds. The wind was stronger than I'd realized from inside, strong enough that I had to lean into it to make forward progress, strong enough that it occasionally staggered me when it gusted. Visibility was maybe 10 feet. Beyond that, everything dissolved into white static. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the swirling snow, just creating a dim glow that illuminated a small sphere around me. The path to cabin 6, which I'd walked dozens of times in daylight, was completely obliterated. I navigated by memory and instinct, counting steps, trying to maintain a straight line toward where I knew the cabin should be. The snow was past my knees in places, deeper where it had drifted. Each step required effort, and I could feel the exertion in my burning lungs and the sweat starting to form under my layers despite the cold. I'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I realized I might have gotten turned around. Everything looked the same, just trees and snow and darkness. I stopped, trying to get my bearings, and that's when I saw the light, faint, diffuse, coming from somewhere ahead and to my right. The glow of a window, maybe, or an exterior light. Had to be cabin 6. There was nothing else out in this direction. I adjusted my course, moving toward the light. The wind was screaming now, making a sound that was almost vocal, like voices crying out in some language I didn't understand. My face mask had accumulated ice around the mouth opening, making it harder to breathe. The cabin materialized out of the snow like a ghost ship emerging from fog. Dark wood siding, peaked roof heavily laden with snow, windows glowing with warm light. The back door, the one Darren had mentioned, was indeed standing open, banging slightly against its frame with each gust of wind. "Darren," I called out, but my voice was immediately stolen by the wind, carried away before it could travel more than a few feet. I approached the open door cautiously. The interior lights were on, which was strange. We always kept unoccupied cabins dark to save power. Had Darren turned them on? Why would he do that? I stepped through the doorway into the mudroom, snow immediately beginning to melt off my clothing and form puddles on the tile floor. The sudden absence of wind was disorienting. My ears were ringing from the silence, or maybe from the roar of blood in my head. "Darren!" I called again, louder now that I wasn't fighting the storm. No response. I moved deeper into the cabin, through the mudroom into the main hallway, the same hallway I'd seen on the frozen camera feed. The layout was identical to all the cabins, entry hall leading to an open-concept living room and kitchen, with bedrooms and a bathroom branching off the corridor. Darren's jacket was on the floor, just lying there in the middle of the hallway, like he'd taken it off and dropped it. Next to it was his radio, face down on the hardwood. I picked up the radio, pressed the transmit button. "Base, this is Darren's radio. Testing." My own voice echoed back at me through the radio. I could hear it coming from the office back at the main lodge, faint but distinct through the storm. So the radios were working, which meant Darren had either deliberately not responded to my calls or he'd been unable to. The bathroom door was closed. A thin line of light showed beneath it, and I could hear running water. The sink sounded like. "Darren, you in there?" I knocked. No response. I tried the handle. Unlocked. I pushed the door open slowly. The bathroom was small but well-appointed. Rustic fixtures, river stone tile, a rainfall shower head. The sink was running, water splashing into the basin and down the drain. A small portable space heater sat in the corner, red coil glowing, throwing off surprising amounts of heat in the confined space. And on the edge of the sink, screen still lit up, was Darren's phone. But no Darren. I picked up the phone. The screen showed a text message conversation with an unsaved number. The most recent message, sent maybe 20 minutes ago, read, "Look up. Just those 2 words. Look up. My eyes went to the ceiling automatically, following the instruction like it was a compulsion rather than a choice. There was a vent, old-fashioned, much larger than modern ductwork. A square opening maybe 2 feet on each side, covered by a metal grate. The kind you only see in buildings from the 1960s or 70s, before efficiency standards made them obsolete. The grate was askew, not removed completely, but shifted to one side, leaving part of the opening exposed. And from that opening, I felt it. Warm air moving, not the forced air from the HVAC system, but something else. A breath of warmth that felt organic somehow, that carried with it a scent I couldn't quite identify. Something musty and wrong. I backed out of the bathroom, backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on that vent, expecting something to emerge at any second. When I hit the door frame, I turned and ran. Out of the cabin, into the storm, not caring about the cold or the wind or anything except getting away from that bathroom. That vent, that presence of something that shouldn't have been there. I ran blind, stumbling through drifts, falling once and scrambling back to my feet without breaking stride. My headlamp beam bounced crazily, illuminating nothing useful, and I had no idea if I was going in the right direction. By sheer luck, or maybe muscle memory, I found my way back to the main lodge, threw myself against the door, fumbled with numb fingers to get my key out, finally got it unlocked and tumbled inside. I locked every door, every window, checked them twice. Then I went to the office and stared at the monitors. The feed from cabin 6 was live again, not frozen, live. The camera showed the hallway, empty. The bathroom door was closed. Everything looked completely normal. As I watched, a figure walked across the frame, quick, purposeful, wearing a dark jacket. It wasn't Darren. Wrong build, wrong gait, wrong everything. The figure moved from the living area toward the bedrooms. Then it was out of frame. I stared at that monitor for the next 7 hours. Didn't move from the chair, didn't even blink more than necessary. Just watched that empty hallway, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. When dawn finally came, gray light filtering through the storm that was still raging outside, I tried the phone again. This time, miraculously, there was a dial tone. I called 911, told them I had a missing person, gave them the location. The rescue crew arrived around noon. By that point, the storm had lessened enough to make travel possible, though still dangerous. They found Darren about 200 yards from cabin 6, face down in a drift behind cabin 4. He was alive. Barely. Severe hypothermia, frostbite on his hands and face, unresponsive. They got him to the hospital, got him stabilized, and eventually he recovered physically. But he didn't remember anything. Not going into cabin 6, not anything that happened after he'd radioed about the open door. His last clear memory was walking across the property toward the cabin. Then nothing. A blank space, and then waking up in the hospital 3 days later. I gave my statement to the police, told them everything, the frozen cameras, the open door, the jacket and radio and phone left behind, the vent in the bathroom, everything except the presence I'd felt, the organic warmth, the message on his phone that said, "Look up." When they asked to see his phone, to check those messages, the phone was gone. They searched the cabin, the snow around it, the path between the cabin and where they'd found Darren. Never found it. I quit the next day, told Keith I was done, that he could keep whatever pay I was owed. But I wasn't going back to that property. Not during the day and certainly not at night. Keith tried to convince me otherwise, offered me triple pay, offered me a different position, offered counseling. I refused it all. Because I knew what I'd felt in that bathroom. I knew that something had been in that vent, something that had led Darren up there somehow, something that had sent him back out into the storm confused and disoriented, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I'd looked into that vent, really looked, instead of just glancing and running, I would have seen something. something that would have changed me fundamentally. That would have opened a door in my mind that could never be closed. I left Idaho a week later. Moved back to Oregon, back to my parents' house, like a college kid who'd failed at independence. I eventually got a job doing corporate security. Climate-controlled office buildings, 9-to-5 shifts, never alone, never isolated. I don't do security work in remote locations anymore. Don't do overnight shifts. And I absolutely don't do anything involving winter storms in places where cell service is spotty and backup is hours away. Because whatever happened that night, whatever took Darren and returned him as an empty shell with no memory, is still out there. Still waiting in old buildings with old ductwork and old vents large enough for something to move through. And it's patient. It can wait for the next storm. The next person unlucky enough to be alone when the snow falls heavy and the temperature drops and the normal rules of reality seem to loosen just enough for other things to slip through. I don't want to be that person again. I was 13 the winter it happened. Old enough that I was starting to be trusted with more independence. Young enough that I hadn't yet developed the kind of healthy paranoia that makes you question everyone's motives. That in-between age where you're not quite a child anymore, but nowhere near being an adult, despite what you might tell yourself. My friend Lennox lived about 10 minutes from my house, down this narrow road that ran along the edge of Prescott State Forest. His place was the last house before the woods proper took over. An old ramshackle building that always looked on the verge of collapse, but somehow never quite got there. Peeling paint, sagging porch, gutters that had separated from the roof and hung at odd angles. The kind of house that would be condemned in a more affluent neighborhood, but was just considered normal in our part of rural New Hampshire. Lennox was one of those kids who existed at maximum intensity at all times. Loud, funny, constantly pushing boundaries to see what he could get away with. He was the kind of friend who made everything more interesting, who turned boring afternoons into adventures, who had this gift for finding trouble without ever quite crossing into serious consequences. Teachers either loved him or hated him. No middle ground. He was either the charming class clown or the disruptive influence, depending on how their day was going. That particular day, school had let out early because of an incoming snowstorm, one of those surprise systems that the meteorologists had missed until it was basically on top of us, suddenly dumping heavy snow without the usual advance warning. The buses had gone, and I'd been trying to figure out how I was getting home when Lennox offered me a ride with his cousin. His cousin was older, early 20s maybe, and had the kind of beat-up sedan that suggested a complicated relationship with automotive maintenance. He didn't say more than 5 words the entire drive, just nodded when I got in and kept his eyes fixed on the increasingly snow-covered roads. Lennox, meanwhile, filled the silence with constant commentary. Roasting me about my gloves. You look like you're about to do surgery, not walk in snow. Making fun of other kids from school, telling elaborate stories about teachers that were probably 70% exaggerated. The cousin dropped us off without ceremony and was gone before we'd even reached the porch. Inside, the house was surprisingly warm, warmer than I'd expected given its exterior condition. Lennox's mom worked night shifts at a warehouse, he explained, and his little brother was in his room playing video games and wasn't interested in being social. We had the living room to ourselves. We hung out for a while, watching TV, eating chips, the kind of aimless hanging out that teenagers do when there's nothing specific planned, but they don't want to be alone. Lennox kept playing with the lights, flipping them off suddenly to jump scare me, laughing when I'd jerk in surprise. It got old after the 3rd time, but I played along because that's what you did with Lennox. You went along with his games until he got bored and moved on to something else. At one point, the power actually did flicker out for maybe 5 seconds. The TV went dark, the heating system cut off mid-hum, and we were suspended in sudden darkness before everything kicked back on. "Lines out here suck," Lennox said casually. "Happens all the time. Last winter we were without power for 3 days." He was quiet for a moment, unusual for him, and then he got this look on his face. The look he'd get when he'd thought of something he considered hilarious, but that probably wasn't. "You want to see something messed up?" he asked. I should have said no. I should have made an excuse about needing to get home, about my parents expecting me, about not wanting to impose. But I was 13, and bored and curious in the way that teenagers are curious about things they know they probably shouldn't see. "Sure," I said. We went out the back door without bothering with proper winter gear. No boots, no gloves, just our sneakers and jackets. Lennox walked out into the snow like it was nothing, and I followed because the alternative was standing in the doorway looking scared. The snow was deeper than I'd expected, past my ankles immediately, deeper in the drifts. My sneakers were soaked through within seconds, cold water seeping through the canvases and soaking my socks. But I kept walking, following Lennox as he headed toward the tree line behind his house. We reached this old shed about 50 yards into the woods, the kind of structure that had obviously been there for decades, slowly sinking into the ground as its foundation rotted. Rust streaked the metal siding, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Lennox popped the latch like he'd done it 1,000 times, which he probably had, and pulled the door open with a squeal of protesting metal. Inside, it smelled wrong. Not just musty or damp, but actively wrong. The kind of smell that your brain immediately registers as associated with death or decay. I could see some tools, a tarp covering something on the ground, a small space heater that clearly wasn't plugged into anything. Lennox grabbed the edge of the tarp with both hands and yanked it back with a flourish, like a magician revealing the prestige of his trick. Underneath was a pile of dead animals. Squirrels, mostly. Dozens of them, tangled together in a heap, in various states of decay. Some were stiff and frozen, little bodies twisted into unnatural positions. Others looked fresher, with frost still sparkling on their fur. I just stood there. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing, trying to slot it into some framework that made sense. Was this some kind of science project? Some weird trapping thing? What was I looking at? Lennox was grinning. "Neighbors got traps out back," he explained like he was showing me his collection of baseball cards. "I've been stealing them for weeks. They freeze on their own out here. No cleanup necessary. Pretty genius, right?" I managed to nod. Couldn't quite manage words yet. He pointed to a red plastic sled leaning against the wall. "Come on, I'll show you the fun part." We dragged the sled out of the shed and up to a slope behind his house. A decent hill that dropped down into what used to be a creek bed but was now just a shallow depression filled with snow. In summer, kids probably rode bikes here. In winter, it was perfect for sledding. Lennox climbed onto the sled and pushed off before I could say anything, sliding down the slope with the kind of reckless abandon that defined everything he did. Instead of just sliding to the bottom, though, he deliberately veered toward the creek bed where I could see there was something under the snow. A bump or depression or something that would disrupt the smooth descent. The sled hit whatever was underneath and went airborne. Lennox flew off, landed hard on his side, and laid there for a moment before sitting up laughing. His laugh had a manic quality to it. Too loud, too sharp, almost hysterical. I made my way down the slope more carefully, expecting to find him hurt. But he was already digging in the snow where the sled had hit, his red raw hands working quickly despite the cold. He pulled out what looked like a frozen raccoon, stiff as a board, mouth open in a permanent snarl, frost covering its fur. "Target practice," Lennox said, standing it upright in the snow. He walked back about 10 paces, picked up a rock, and threw it hard. It hit the raccoon directly in the face, knocking it over. Lennox howled with laughter and immediately set it back up for another throw. I watched him do this 3 more times with different frozen animals that he dug up from the snow. A possum, something gray that might have been a cat, another raccoon. Each time he'd set them up, throw rocks until he knocked them down, laugh that increasingly unhinged laugh. "Your turn," he finally said, holding out a rock to me. I shook my head. "I'm good." His face changed slightly. Not angry, exactly, but something close to it. Disappointment? Maybe. Or contempt. "What, you too soft for this?" "I'm just cold," I said, which was true, but not the reason I was declining. He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Whatever, but you've got to see the big one." Before I could protest, he grabbed my arm and pulled me deeper into the woods. Not forcefully, not violently, but with an insistence that made it clear refusing wasn't really an option. We were moving away from his house now, into the denser part of the forest where the trees pressed close together and the snow lay heavy on branches overhead. My feet were completely numb. I couldn't feel my toes anymore, couldn't feel the individual squelch of wet socks in soaked shoes. Just a distant ache that I knew would hurt worse once I warmed up. We reached a massive tree, old growth, the kind that had been there for 100 years or more. The trunk had split at the base, creating a hollow space that had been colonized by rot and time. Lennox dropped to his knees in front of the hollow and started clearing away snow, moving fast with practiced motions that said he'd done this before, recently and repeatedly. "You're going to love this," he said without looking back at me. "This is the best one." He reached into the hollow, which was deeper than I'd realized, his arm disappearing past the elbow, and pulled out a black garbage bag, the kind you'd use for yard waste, thick and heavy-duty. He set it down in the snow between us and looked up at me with an expression that I can only describe as proud, like he was about to show me his greatest achievement. "Ready?" he asked. I wasn't. I really, really wasn't. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to run, to get away from Lennox and this tree and whatever was in that bag. But I was 13 and didn't know how to articulate that feeling, didn't know how to say, "This is wrong and I need to leave," without sounding weak or scared. So I nodded. He opened the bag. Inside was a deer head. Just the head. Severed at the neck, the cut rough and jagged like it had been torn rather than cleanly cut. The fur was matted and frozen, frost clinging to the eyelashes and coating the inside of the nostrils. The eyes were still there, glassy and vacant, staring at nothing. The smell that came out of the bag was immediate and overwhelming, decay and cold and something else, something mineral and wrong. I gagged, turned my head, felt my stomach lurch. Lennox was just staring at it, not smiling anymore, not laughing, just staring with an intensity that was somehow more disturbing than his earlier manic energy. "Found it last week," he said quietly. "Well, found the rest of it. Kept the head. The rest wasn't interesting." That's when something clicked in my head. Not a conscious decision, just an instinctive shift from "this is weird" to "I need to leave right now." "I need to pee," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "So, pee," Lennox said without looking away from the deer head. "No, like, I really need to go. I'm going to head back to your house." He finally looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I couldn't read. Something calculating. "You won't tell anyone about this, right? About any of it?" "No," I said immediately. "Of course not." "Good, because this is our thing, our secret." I nodded, already backing away. "Yeah, totally, our secret. I'll be right back." I turned and started walking toward where I thought the house was. Didn't run. Not yet. Just walked at a quick pace, trying to maintain the fiction that I was coming back, that this was just a bathroom break. When I couldn't hear him moving behind me anymore, when I'd put enough distance that the trees blocked line of sight, I ran. Ran as fast as I could through snow that grabbed at my legs and threatened to trip me. Ran without caring about the branches that caught on my jacket or the snow that got kicked up into my face. I made it back to his house, burst through the back door, and found his little brother still planted in front of the TV. He barely glanced at me. "Where's your phone?" I asked, trying not to sound as panicked as I felt. He pointed to the kitchen without taking his eyes off the screen. I called my dad, told him I was at Lennox's house and needed a ride home. He could hear something in my voice because he didn't ask questions, just said he'd be there in 20 minutes. I waited by the front door, coat on, watching through the window for my dad's car. Lennox came back after about 15 minutes. His hands were red and raw from the cold, and there was snow caked up past his knees. He waved at me from the porch, that same manic grin back on his face. I waved back. What else could I do? When my dad pulled up, I was in the car before he'd fully stopped moving. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, fine, just cold." We never talked about that day, Lennox and I. The next time I saw him at school, he acted completely normal. Same jokes, same energy. Like nothing had happened. And because I didn't know what else to do, I acted normal too. But I stopped going to his house, made excuses when he invited me over. Gradually, over the course of a few months, we drifted into different friend groups, different social circles. By 8th grade, we barely acknowledged each other in the halls. I never told anyone about the shed or the deer head, or the way he'd laughed while throwing rocks at frozen animals. Kept that secret the way he'd asked me to, though not out of loyalty, out of a fear I couldn't quite articulate, that speaking it out loud would somehow make it more real. That spring, there was a small article in the local paper about someone finding a bunch of dead animals in the woods near Prescott State Forest. Squirrels, raccoons, possums, all piled together. Officials said it was probably coyotes or fisher cats or some other predator creating a cache. I knew better. I don't know where Lennox is now. We graduated high school. I went to college. Last I heard, he'd gone into some kind of trade work. I've deliberately never looked him up, never tried to find out what happened to him or where he ended up. Because sometimes I think about that afternoon, about the efficiency with which he'd cleared the snow from that tree hollow, about the pride in his voice when he showed me the deer head, about the way his laugh had gotten more and more unhinged as he knocked over frozen animals. And I wonder if stopping at dead animals was enough for him, or if he eventually needed something more, something bigger, something that fought back or struggled or cried. I don't want to know the answer to that question. So I've just let it go, packed it away in the part of my memory where I keep things I don't want to examine too closely, and I don't go sledding anymore. Even now, 20 years later, when my own kids beg to go to the local hill after a snowstorm, I tell them it's too cold or too dangerous or that I'm too busy. I don't tell them it's because every time I see a sled, I remember the sound of rocks hitting frozen fur and Lennox's laugh echoing through the winter woods. That morning started like any other until my sister called around 9 a.m. Her voice had that particular quality, trying to sound calm but with an underlying current of stress that I knew meant something was wrong. "Mom's back in the hospital," she said. "It's probably nothing serious, just precautionary, but David and I think someone should be there with her. Can you come?" I was at work, halfway through a spreadsheet that I'd been putting off for a week, surrounded by the low hum of office conversation and the smell of stale coffee. The kind of mundane morning that makes you forget that real life, with its emergencies and crises, is happening simultaneously just outside the bubble of fluorescent-lit productivity. "Of course," I said, already mentally cataloging what I needed to do. "I'll wrap up what I can here and leave by early afternoon. I can be there by dinner." My sister lived in Binghamton, New York, about 3 hours from where I was in northeast Pennsylvania. An easy drive in good weather, The kind of trip I'd made dozens of times. Take 81 north to Scranton, then merge onto 11, wind through those small former mining towns that peppered the landscape, cross into New York and follow 17 to Binghamton. Simple. I could do it in my sleep. I packed light. Just an overnight bag with a change of clothes, phone charger, toiletries. The kind of packing you do when you don't want to admit this might be serious, when keeping it minimal feels like a talisman against worse possibilities. If I only bring one change of clothes, surely that means Mom will be fine and I'll be driving home tomorrow. I left work around 4 p.m. The forecast had mentioned snow, some system moving in from the west, but nothing that seemed particularly threatening. Light snow, the report said, maybe accumulating to an inch or two. I'd driven through worse. The first hour was fine. Traffic was light, roads were clear. NPR was playing something about international trade policy that I was half listening to, while my mind wandered through work problems and family concerns. The sun was low on the horizon, that particular angle of December afternoon light that turns everything gold and nostalgic. Then I crossed into the second hour, past Scranton, and I noticed the snow starting. Just a few flakes at first, those big lazy ones that drift down without urgency. Pretty even, the kind of snow you see on Christmas cards. But by the time I passed Clark's Summit, it had shifted. The flakes were smaller now, falling faster, driven by a wind that I could feel buffeting the car. The road was starting to show accumulation, not enough to be dangerous yet, but enough that I had to turn my windshield wipers to a faster setting and pay more attention to the road than the podcast. I should have pulled off. There were exits, small towns where I could have stopped, grabbed dinner, waited for the storm to pass or at least ease up. But I was only an hour out from Binghamton. My sister was expecting me. Mom was in the hospital. Pulling over felt like quitting, and I wasn't a quitter. So I kept driving. The gas light came on at exactly 6:03 p.m. I know because I glanced at the clock and mentally calculated how much further I could push it. Maybe 15 miles before I hit reserve. The gauge had been unreliable recently. Sometimes the warning light came on with a quarter tank still left. Sometimes it waited until I was running on fumes. I'd been meaning to get it checked. A green exit sign emerged from the increasingly heavy snow. Stone Ridge. Food, gas, lodging. I didn't recognize the name, but that wasn't unusual. This part of New York was dotted with small towns I'd never bothered to learn. Places that existed primarily as waypoints between destinations that actually mattered. But the promise of gas was enough. I clicked my blinker and took the exit. The ramp curved down and to the right, descending more steeply than I'd expected. I had to brake carefully. The road was slicker than it had looked from the highway. The ramp fed into a 2-lane road that immediately began winding through dense forest, trees pressing close on both sides. No other tire tracks visible. The road was covered in unbroken snow, which meant either no one else had taken this exit recently, or the snow was falling fast enough to fill in tracks almost immediately. Neither possibility was reassuring. I drove slowly, following the curve of the road as it descended into what I assumed was the town proper. After about half a mile, I saw lights, warm and yellow against the white and gray of the storm. A small gas station, and next to it, connected by a stretch of poorly maintained asphalt, a diner. The gas station had 2 ancient pumps under a flickering overhead light. A single car sat at the edge of the lot, a faded red sedan that looked like it had been there for a while, snow already accumulating on the hood and roof. I pulled up to the pump and got out. The cold hit immediately, sharp and bitter, the kind of cold that makes your eyes water. I fumbled with the pump, my gloves making it hard to manipulate the nozzle, finally got it working, and stood there shivering while the numbers on the ancient analog counter slowly climbed. The whole time I was filling up, I had this sensation of being watched. Nothing I could point to specifically. No one was visible in the gas station office. No faces in windows. Just that primitive awareness that predates language, that evolved to keep our ancestors alive on the savannah. The feeling of attention focused on you. I finished pumping, screwed the gas cap back on, and decided I needed to warm up before getting back on the road. My fingers were numb, my face hurt from the wind, and the idea of sitting in a warm diner for 20 minutes before continuing seemed reasonable. The diner was one of those timeless roadside places that existed in 1,000 variations across America. Cracked vinyl booths, laminated menus, a long counter with red vinyl-topped stools, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. The windows were fogged up from the temperature differential, creating a sense of isolation from the storm outside. A bell above the door chimed when I entered. The woman behind the counter looked up. Late 50s, maybe. Gray hair, tired eyes, wearing a faded blue apron with a name stitched on it that I couldn't quite read in the dim light. "Evening," she said. Not friendly, not unfriendly. Just tired. Pretty rough out there. "Yeah," I agreed, sliding onto one of the counter stools. "Just wanted to warm up for a bit before getting back on the road." She slid a laminated menu toward me without comment. I scanned it without really reading. Everything looked like standard diner fare. Coffee, soup, sandwiches. "Just coffee and soup, please," I said. "Whatever soup you have is fine." She nodded, wrote nothing down, and disappeared through a door marked kitchen. I looked around. The place was empty except for me. No other customers, no sound from the kitchen, just the buzz of the lights and the faint hum of the heating system. It felt oddly suspended, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. Through the front windows, between the gaps in the condensation, I could see the street. The storm was picking up intensity. The snow was falling so heavily now that visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet. And across the street, barely visible through the swirling white, a figure stood under a broken streetlight. A man, tall, wearing a long brown coat buttoned up to the neck. No hat, no gloves, just standing there, completely still, facing the diner. I couldn't see his face clearly. The distance and the snow made details impossible. But I could feel his attention, knew with absolute certainty that he was looking directly at me. I looked away, uncomfortable. Counted the sugar packets in the container on the counter. Examined my hands. When I looked back, he was gone. Just gone. No figure under the streetlight, no footprints in the snow leading away. Just empty street and falling snow and that broken light fixture swaying slightly in the wind. The woman emerged from the kitchen carrying a mug of coffee and a bowl of soup on a tray. She set them down in front of me without comment. The coffee was lukewarm and the soup, I couldn't identify what kind it was supposed to be, smelled faintly metallic. I forced down a few spoonfuls anyway, just to be polite, and sipped the coffee even though it tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since morning. The whole time I felt increasingly anxious. Not afraid, exactly, just wrong. Like I'd made a mistake coming here. Like I needed to leave. I pulled out a $10 bill, left it on the counter without waiting for change, and headed for the door. Outside, the red sedan that had been at the gas station was gone. My car sat alone in the lot, already accumulating a fresh layer of snow in the few minutes I'd been inside. I hurried across the lot, boots slipping on the packed snow, got to my car and grabbed the door handle. It was unlocked. The driver's door was cracked open maybe an inch, not wide, just slightly ajar. The dome light wasn't on, which it should have been if the door was open. I knew I'd locked it. I lock my car automatically, compulsively, every single time I get out. It's so ingrained that I often can't remember doing it, have to go back and physically check to reassure myself. But I was absolutely certain I'd locked it. I pulled the door open fully, letting the dome light flicker on. The interior looked undisturbed. No signs of anything moved or taken, no trash or items that hadn't been there before. But the air inside felt different somehow, colder than it should have been, with a faint scent I couldn't identify. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and locked them again for good measure. Started the engine and sat there for a moment, watching my breath fog in the air while the heater struggled to warm up. My phone GPS lit up, recalculating the route back to the highway. But instead of showing the simple route I'd taken to get here, back up the exit ramp to 17, it suggested a different path. A series of local roads that wound through the area, supposedly faster than backtracking. I should have ignored it, should have just retraced my route back to the highway where there would be other cars, other people, the infrastructure of civilization. But the GPS insisted this way was faster, and I was already later than I'd planned to be, and my sister was expecting me. So I followed the blue line on the screen. The road twisted through forest that seemed to press closer with each mile. No houses, no lights, no signs of human habitation. Just trees and snow and the occasional glimpse of something that might have been a deer or might have been shadows playing tricks. 10 minutes in, the GPS spoke. "Turn right on Hickory Hollow Road." There was no road, just a gap between trees, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, packed with snow and looking more like a hiking trail than anything designed for cars. I stopped, staring at the opening. This couldn't be right. But the GPS showed my blue dot right at the turn, the route line clearly indicating I should go this way. I turned. The car immediately protested, wheels spinning, fighting for traction in snow that was clearly deeper than I'd realized. Branches scraped along both sides, making sounds like fingernails on metal. I crept forward at maybe 5 miles per hour, knuckles white on the steering wheel, absolutely certain I was about to get stuck and have to spend the night out here. Then I saw him, the man from the street light, standing in the middle of the narrow track, maybe 30 feet ahead. Same brown coat, same perfect stillness. But now I was close enough to see more details. His face was pale, features indistinct in the headlights, and he wasn't moving at all. Not swaying, not shifting weight, not even appearing to breathe. I stopped the car, stared at him through the windshield. I hit the horn, a long, loud blast that should have scared anyone normal. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. I shifted into reverse, but the wheels just spun. Packed snow behind me, packed snow in front. I was stuck. I looked down at my phone. No signal. Of course not. I was in the middle of nowhere, in a storm, surrounded by trees that probably blocked whatever weak signal existed out here anyway. I looked up again. He was closer. Not walking. I hadn't seen him move. Just closer. Maybe 15 feet from my front bumper now. Panic hit, real and overwhelming. I jammed my foot on the accelerator, not caring about finesse or technique or anything except moving. The wheels spun, the car rocked, and then, somehow, caught traction. I lurched forward, toward him. I was going to hit him. At this speed it wouldn't be fatal, but it would definitely be an impact, and every instinct I had screamed that hitting another person with a car was wrong, even if that person was standing motionless in the middle of a road during a blizzard. At the last second, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. The car slewed sideways, back end sliding, front tires catching on something under the snow. For a moment, I was certain I was going to slam into a tree or flip or crash in some spectacular way. Then I was past him. In my rearview mirror, just for a second, I saw him still standing there, completely still, watching my car fishtail away. Except now, there were lights behind me. Bright headlights, high-mounted like a truck or SUV. Where had they come from? There'd been no one behind me on this road. Relief flooded through me so intense I almost started crying. Someone else. Help. Back up. I wasn't alone out here. The lights were steady in my mirror, not getting closer, but not falling behind either. just maintaining distance. I kept driving, focused on the narrow track ahead, letting whoever was behind me follow. After maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours, I saw signs of civilization, a paved road crossing the track I was on. I pulled onto it, tires finally hitting clear pavement instead of snow, and felt the car stabilize. I stopped, threw the transmission into park, and looked in my mirror to wave thank you to the vehicle that had been behind me. Nothing. No lights. No vehicle. The narrow track I'd just emerged from showed no tire tracks except my own, and even those were already being filled in by the falling snow. I sat there, engine running, staring at empty road and trying to process what had just happened. Where had the lights gone? There was nowhere to turn off. I would have seen it. The track was narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle. And the vehicle behind me couldn't have backed up that entire distance in the time it took me to reach the paved road. Unless there had been no vehicle. Unless the lights had been something else. I didn't let myself finish that thought. Just put the car back in drive and followed the paved road until I saw signs for Route 17. Got back on the highway and didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of Binghamton glowing on the horizon. I arrived at the hospital around 9:30 p.m., 3 hours later than planned. My sister was in the waiting room, worried, and I told her the roads had been bad. Didn't mention Stone Ridge or the gas station or the man in the brown coat or the impossible lights. Mom was fine, it turned out. Just a scare, some tests that had come back normal. Observation overnight to be safe. I stayed with her that evening, helped get her discharged the next morning, and then drove home in bright daylight on clear roads. 2 days later, when I had time to think, I tried to find Stone Ridge on a map. Looked at every exit off Route 17, used Google Maps to search the area, even called the New York Doughty to ask about towns along that stretch. Nothing. No town called Stone Ridge anywhere near my route. No gas station, no diner, no exits matching the one I'd taken. I checked my credit card statement. The gas purchase showed up, $34.50, dated and time-stamped. But instead of a location, it just said automated fuel pump, with no associated address or business name. I drove that route again a month later, in daylight, specifically looking for that exit. Never found it. Every exit I passed was clearly marked, led to actual towns I could find on maps, had visible infrastructure and traffic. But I know what I saw. I know where I went. And I know that somewhere off Route 17, in a place that doesn't exist on any map, there's a town called Stone Ridge. A gas station with a red sedan that's always parked at the edge of the lot. A diner where tired women serve lukewarm coffee. And a man in a brown coat who stands perfectly still and watches and waits. I don't drive that route anymore. When I visit my sister now, I take a different highway. Longer, more traffic, less convenient. But at least every exit leads somewhere real, somewhere I can find again, somewhere that exists in consensus reality. Because some places, some thin places where the snow falls heavy and the roads disappear and you're alone in the storm, those aren't meant to be found. And if you do find them, you shouldn't try to go back. The snow had started falling just before 6 p.m. and I'd gone out earlier to top off the gas tank and grab some snacks, figuring I might get snowed in for the night. By the time I got back, the county was already sending out those flashing alerts, all caps, urgent, the kind that make your phone buzz with emphasis. Non-essential travel lockdown, extreme weather conditions, stay indoors. I was house-sitting for my cousin and his wife while they were visiting her parents in Ohio for the week. Their place was way up north, not just small-town Minnesota, but the kind of deeply rural Minnesota where neighbor is a concept more theoretical than practical. The kind of place where your closest neighbor is 2 miles away, where the roads stop getting plowed reliably after the first few storms, where you learn to be self-sufficient because help isn't coming quickly if something goes wrong. The house itself was nice. Modern construction, good insulation, all the amenities you'd expect from a young professional couple who decided to trade urban convenience for rural isolation. Big windows that during the day would have provided stunning views of the surrounding forest. A well-stocked kitchen, reliable heating, backup generator in case the power went out. Comfortable, even cozy, despite its isolated location. But at night, especially during a storm, that isolation felt different. The darkness outside the windows wasn't the darkness of a city where streetlights and neighboring houses create ambient glow. This was complete darkness, absolute. The kind that makes you realize how much of human history was spent huddled around fires and fearing what moved in the night. By 9 p.m., the wind had picked up hard, not gusting but maintaining a steady roar that I could hear even through the house's thick walls. Snow was being thrown against the windows with enough force that it sounded like sand or small pebbles. The living room lights flickered once or twice, just briefly, just enough to make me glance at the ceiling and mentally locate where they kept the flashlights and candles. I was camped on the couch in sweats and a hoodie, half watching some action movie I didn't really care about, half dozing in that comfortable in-between state where you're not quite asleep but not fully awake either. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. Sharp, deliberate, evenly spaced. Knuckles on wood. Front door. I sat up, momentarily disoriented. The TV was still playing, some explosion scene that made it hard to be sure I'd actually heard what I thought I'd heard. I muted the TV and listened. Nothing. Just the wind, just the snow hitting the windows. I waited another minute, then slowly got up and walked to the front door, looked through the peephole, just darkness and swirling snow. The porch light barely penetrating the storm. I cracked the door open maybe 3 inches. Cold air immediately flooding in. "Hello," I called out. Wind and snow were the only response. I stepped out onto the porch, barefoot like an idiot, and looked around. The porch was covered, protected somewhat from the direct onslaught of the storm, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal, no package or delivery. More importantly, no footprints. The snow on the porch steps and the walkway beyond was completely undisturbed, a pristine white surface that showed no indication anyone had approached the house. I went back inside, locked the door, stood there for a moment feeling unsettled without quite knowing why. People don't knock on doors in the middle of a blizzard. Even if they needed help, even if they were in trouble, how would they have gotten here? There were no tire tracks in the driveway, no footprints approaching the house. Probably just the wind, I told myself. A branch hitting the door, or ice shifting, or the house settling. Old houses made all kinds of sounds. Except this house wasn't old. It was maybe 5 years old. Modern construction, everything still tight and new. I went back to the couch, unmuted the movie, tried to recapture that comfortable drowsiness from before. Couldn't quite manage it. I was alert now, ears straining to hear anything over the sound of the storm and the movie. 10 minutes later, 3 knocks again. Same rhythm, same spacing. But this time from the back of the house. I muted the TV immediately and stood up. The back of the house opened onto a small deck that overlooked the forest. No roads back there, no paths, nothing but trees and snow and darkness. I walked through the kitchen to the mudroom, where a glass door led out to the deck. The outside light clicked on automatically as I approached. Motion-activated sensor. Through the frosted glass, I could see the deck, the railing, and beyond that just the wall of falling snow. Nothing moved. No one stood there. The snow on the deck was undisturbed. I opened the door a few inches, cold air rushing in to steal my breath, and called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" My voice was swallowed by the wind almost before it left my mouth. No response. Nothing but the endless roar of the storm. I closed the door, locked it, and stood there staring through the glass. Trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The wind. Had to be the wind. Moving things around, creating sounds that mimicked knocking. Except wind doesn't knock with that specific rhythm. 3 evenly spaced impacts. Deliberate, intentional. I went back to the living room and tried calling my cousin. Straight to voicemail. Probably had his phone turned off overnight. I tried his wife. Same thing. I wasn't even sure what I'd say if they had answered. "Hi, I know you're on vacation, but I'm hearing mysterious knocking and I'm scared." That would go over great. I sat back down on the couch but didn't turn the movie back on. Just sat in the silence, or relative silence, with the storm still raging outside us, and listened. Nothing for maybe 20 minutes. Long enough that I started to convince myself I'd overreacted, that it really had been nothing, that I should just go to bed and laugh about this in the morning. Then 3 knocks from the side of the house. Kitchen window, the one above the sink. I got up slowly. That window was high, maybe 6 feet off the ground outside, too high for someone to reach easily without a ladder or something to stand on. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the window. Dark outside, my own reflection staring back at me from the glass. I moved closer, cupping my hands around my face to block the reflection, trying to see outside. Nothing. Just snow and darkness and the vague shapes of trees swaying in the wind. But then, as I stood there, I saw them. Marks on the window. On the outside, pressed against the glass from the external side. Handprints, 5-fingered, palm-wide, right at eye level. Multiple prints, overlapping slightly, like someone had pressed their hands against the glass, and then shifted position and pressed again. I jerked back from the window fast enough that I slammed my hip into the counter. The pain barely registered. All my attention was locked on those handprints, trying to understand how they could be there. The window was 6 feet off the ground outside. There was nothing below it to stand on. No deck, no ledge, just a straight drop to ground level. And I'd just checked outside moments ago. There'd been no one there. Unless someone had come since I'd checked, unless someone was outside right now, pressed against the house. 3 more knocks. Dining room window, directly behind me. I spun around, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The dining room was part of the open concept main floor, separated from the kitchen by an island, but with no walls between. The window there faced the side yard, looking out toward where the driveway curved up to the house. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to approach that window, not to see what was outside, to instead run upstairs and lock myself in a bedroom and wait for daylight. But I moved toward it anyway. Can't explain why. Some compulsion stronger than fear, some need to know, to see, to understand what was happening. The window was dark. My reflection showed a pale, wide-eyed face that looked more scared than I felt internally. I pressed close to the glass, hands cupped around my face again. A face stared back at me, not my reflection. A face on the other side of the glass. Pale, indistinct features, dark hollows where eyes should be. Close enough that if not for the glass, we'd be inches apart. I screamed and stumbled backward, tripped over a chair, went down hard on the floor. Pain shot through my tailbone, but I barely felt it, already scrambling backward, eyes locked on the window. The face was gone. Just darkness and snow, and my own reflection again. I got to my feet, shaking so hard my knees barely held me. Grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed 911. No signal. I looked at the screen. 0 bars. Just that empty triangle with an X through it. I walked to different parts of the house, holding the phone up, trying to find any signal at all. Nothing. The storm must have taken out a cell tower, or the snow was blocking the signal, or something. The landline. The house had a landline for emergencies. I ran to the office, grabbed the cordless phone from its cradle on the desk. Dead. Not even a dial tone. Just silence. Outside, The storm was still raging. Inside, every light was still on, every system still working. But I was completely cut off from the outside world, and something was outside the house, circling it, knocking on windows and leaving handprints and pressing its face against the glass. 3 more knocks, directly above me. I looked up at the ceiling. That was impossible. The knock had come from above, which meant the roof. Something was on the roof. I heard footsteps. Not inside the house. Outside, on the roof. Slow, heavy footsteps moving across the shingles, from one end of the house toward the other. I could track their progress by sound, could hear each distinct footfall even over the wind. They stopped directly above where I was standing. Silence. Just the wind and my own ragged breathing. Then a long, slow, dragging sound. Like something heavy being pulled across the roof, moving from above the office toward the living room. I backed out of the office and into the main living space, tilting my head back, tracking the sound as it moved overhead. It stopped above the center of the living room, right over the big skylight that provided natural light during the day. I stared up at that skylight. It was dark now. Just a square of black glass in the ceiling. Snow had accumulated on it, partially obscuring it, but through the gaps I could see the night sky, or would have been able to in clear weather. Something moved up there, a shadow passing across the skylight, blocking what little light filtered through the snow. A shape, indistinct, but definitely present. Then the knocking started again. Multiple locations simultaneously. Front door, back door, kitchen window, dining room window, upstairs windows I could hear even from down here. A cacophony of knocking, all that same 3-beat rhythm surrounding the house. I ran upstairs. Don't know what I was thinking. Maybe that being on the 2nd floor would somehow be safer. Maybe that I could see more from up there. Maybe just blind panic. I went to the master bedroom, locked the door behind me, and dragged a dresser in front of it. Then I grabbed my phone and checked again. Still no signal. The knocking continued, all around the house, constant now. That steady 3-beat rhythm like a heartbeat, never stopping, never varying. I went to the bedroom window and looked out. The storm was intensifying, visibility down to maybe 5 feet. But in that limited sphere of visibility, I saw them. Footprints, fresh footprints in the snow circling the house. Multiple sets, different sizes, appearing from nowhere and disappearing into nowhere. Just partial tracks that suggested movement around the perimeter of the house. And between the tracks, nothing. No figures, no people, no explanation for how the prints were appearing. I backed away from the window and sat on the bed, phone in hand, trying to think rationally despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Options. What were my options? Stay here and wait it out until morning. The house was secure, doors locked, windows intact. Whatever was outside couldn't get in unless it broke something, and I'd hear that. I could barricade myself in this room and wait for daylight. Or I could try to get to my car. It was parked in the driveway, maybe 30 yards from the front door. I had keys. If I could make it to the car, I could drive away, storm or no storm, lockdown or no lockdown. Anything would be better than staying here. The knocking stopped. Sudden, complete silence, or as close to silence as you can get with a storm raging outside. The absence of the knocking was somehow worse than its presence. At least when it was knocking, I knew where it was. Now it could be anywhere, doing anything. I waited, barely breathing, listening. A new sound. Scratching. Not knocking, scratching. Long, slow, like nails or claws being dragged across wood. Coming from downstairs, from the front door. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then it stopped. More silence. I stayed on the bed, motionless, phone clutched in my hand even though it was useless, and waited. The scratching started again. This time from the bedroom door, right outside in the hallway. Long, slow scratches, like something running its nails down the wood grain, exploring, testing. I stared at the door. The dresser I'd pushed in front of it suddenly seemed completely inadequate. If something wanted to come through that door, a piece of furniture wasn't going to stop it. The scratching stopped. Silence again. Then a voice, muffled, like it was coming from far away or through thick glass. But definitely a voice, definitely words. "Why didn't you help me?" The voice was wrong. Not in terms of emotion or tone, but in terms of reality. It sounded flat, dimensionless, like a recording played through a bad speaker, like something trying to replicate a human voice without quite understanding how. "Why didn't you answer?" I didn't respond, didn't move, barely breathed. "Why did you ignore me when I needed you?" The voice was closer now, right outside the door, and I realized with a sick horror that it wasn't asking questions. It was reciting them, like someone going through a script, hitting the right words but not actually communicating. Performance without understanding. The door handle started to turn. I watched it from the bed, watched the lever-style handle slowly rotate downward as if someone was carefully, deliberately pressing it. The door pushed slightly against the dresser, not hard, just testing. The handle turned back up. Released. Silence. I sat there for the rest of the night. Didn't sleep, didn't relax. Just sat on that bed watching the door and the window and listening to every sound. The storm continued to rage outside, and inside nothing else happened. No more knocking, no more scratching, no more voices. When dawn finally came, gray light filtering through the storm that was still falling but less intensely, I crept downstairs. The front door was undamaged. The windows were intact. Everything looked normal. Except for the note. It was taped to the inside of the front door. White paper, neat handwriting in black ink. I hadn't seen it when I'd gone upstairs, which meant it had appeared sometime during the night. "You heard me. Why didn't you come?" I didn't pack. Didn't clean up. Didn't do any of the things a responsible house-sitter would do. I grabbed my coat and keys, ran to my car, and left. Drove through snow that was still falling, on roads that hadn't been plowed. Drove recklessly and too fast and didn't care because anything was better than staying in that house. I called my cousin from a gas station 20 miles away. Told him there'd been an emergency, that I'd had to leave, that I was sorry but I couldn't go back. He was confused and concerned, but I couldn't explain. Still can't, really. How do you tell someone that their house, their normal, modern, completely ordinary house, is wrong? That something lives in the space around it. Something that knocks and scratches and presses its face against windows and wants to be let in. They moved out 6 months later, put the house on the market, sold it at a loss, relocated to Minneapolis. My cousin and I don't talk about it, and I don't ask why they left, but I know. I know he experienced something too. Something he doesn't want to discuss. Something that made living there impossible. The house sold to a family from out of state. I looked them up once, found their names in the real estate records. I think about calling them sometimes, warning them. But what would I say? Don't answer if you hear knocking during a storm. Don't look out the windows at night. Get out before winter comes. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am. But sometimes, when it snows heavy and the wind picks up, I still hear it. That 3-beat knock. That slow scratching. And I remember that flat, wrong voice asking why I didn't help. I don't know what I could have done differently. Don't know what would have satisfied it or made it leave. I just know I'm never house-sitting again. Not in winter. Not alone, not anywhere the snow falls heavy and the isolation is complete and something might be outside waiting for permission to come in. Because some invitations, once given, can never be revoked.